The light was dying. It bled out across the vast, bruised sky of sagebrush reach, spilling colors of crushed plum and fading gold over the endless sea of sage and dry grass. The wind, a constant presence in this part of Wyoming, carried the high, lonesome scent of pine from the distant Bighorn Mountains and the closer, more intimate smell of worn leather and horse sweat. It was a cold scent, a clean scent, the smell of a life lived far from the cloying press of towns. Down in a shallow basin, nestled against a stand of weathered cottonwoods, a single cabin stood its ground against the immensity of the land. It was less a home and more a stubborn fact, built of hewn logs chinked with mud and resolve. As the last of the sun's warmth was stolen by the encroaching dusk, a warm, flickering light bloomed in its single window, a beacon of defiant life in the encroaching dark. Inside, Iris Callahan stood by that very window. Though she was not looking out, her gaze was fixed on the rough-hewn floorboards, on the whorls and knots in the wood, on anything but the reflection of her own face in the wavy glass. Her hands were clasped tightly before her, knuckles white. A small gesture of self-containment in a world that had suddenly become both terrifyingly large and claustrophobically small. The room behind her was sparse but orderly, dominated by a large stone hearth where a fire crackled and spat, casting long, dancing shadows that made the space seem to breathe. A simple table with 2 chairs, a dry sink, and shelves holding a few tins and clay pots made up the rest of the main room. Everything smelled of wood smoke, old iron, and something else, a quiet, masculine scent that was the scent of the man who owned this place, her husband. The word felt alien on her tongue, a borrowed garment that did not fit. She heard a sound from outside, the soft, rhythmic clatter of leather harness straps against the hitching post. It was a gentle sound, but it made her heart jump into her throat, a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She took a slow, deliberate breath, drawing the smoky air deep into her lungs, trying to anchor herself. This was safety. This was the bargain she had made. The door opened, letting in a swirl of cold air that smelled of snow and horse. Roan Vale stepped inside, bringing the vastness of the twilight in with him. He was not a tall man, but broad in the shoulders, built with the dense, functional strength of someone who worked from sunup to sundown. His face, shadowed by the brim of his hat, was a landscape of its own, weathered by sun and wind, with lines etched around his eyes and mouth that spoke of hardship and patience in equal measure. He moved with a quiet economy, a restraint that seemed born of a long acquaintance with silence. He shut the door softly, the latch clicking into place with a sound of finality. He removed his hat, a dark felt stained with sweat and trail dust, and hung it on a wooden peg by the door. Then came the sheepskin-lined coat, heavy with the dampness of an early fall snow flurry encountered in the high country. He draped it over the back of a chair near the fire, his movements unhurried, deliberate. He did not look at her immediately, giving her space, giving her time. It was a courtesy as profound as any spoken pleasantry. Roan Vale was a widower, a man who had already buried one wife and, with her, perhaps the part of himself that knew the easy language of courtship and romance. What was left was a man who communicated in deeds, in the solid presence of his being. The document that bound them was tucked inside her worn reticule, the ink from the preacher at Birch Chapel barely dry. It wasn't a marriage born of longing glances or whispered promises. It was a contract, a fortification. He had offered her the protection of his name and his roof. She had brought with her nothing but the clothes on her back and a ghost in her eyes. It was a fair trade, she told herself. It had to be. He finally turned his gaze to her. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, a pale, clear gray that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. They held a deep, settled quiet, the quiet of a man who spent more time with horses and cattle than with people. Her own voice, when she found it, was a fragile thing, barely a whisper against the crackle of the fire. I don't know how to be a wife." The admission felt like a failing, a confession of her inadequacy for the role she had just formally assumed. She did not know how to cook for a man, how to mend his clothes, how to fill the echoing spaces of a lonely cabin with the soft hum of domesticity. She only knew how to be afraid, how to be watchful, how to survive. Roan considered her words for a long moment. He didn't dismiss them, didn't offer false reassurances. He simply took them in, weighed them. He walked over to the hearth, picked up the iron poker, and gently nudged a log, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. "Then just be here," he said, his voice a low, rough baritone, as steady as the stone of the fireplace. He looked at her over his shoulder, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Breathe with me. That'll be enough for now." And with those words, he gave her the only thing she truly needed: permission to be broken, to be uncertain, and to simply exist within the walls he had offered as a sanctuary. Later, after a silent meal of bean soup he had ladled from a pot simmering on the hob, the unspoken question of the night arranged itself in the small space between them. The cabin had only one proper bed, a sturdy frame with a thick mattress stuffed with straw and topped with layers of wool blankets and a heavy quilt. It was his bed. He had not said a word about the sleeping arrangements, and Iris had been consumed with a quiet, simmering dread about what would be expected of her. Roan seemed to sense it. After clearing their bowls, he took one of the thickest wool blankets from a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. He then retrieved his saddle, which he had brought inside to protect from the damp, and placed it near the hearth to serve as a pillow. He laid the blanket out on the floorboards, a clear and unambiguous declaration of his intentions. He would take the floor. The relief that washed over Iris was so potent it almost made her knees buckle. It was another kindness, another act of silent understanding that spoke louder than a volume of poetry. He was giving her not just the bed, but the entire night, free from obligation or fear. When it was time to retire, she turned her back to him, facing the wall as she unbuttoned her worn calico dress. She could feel his presence behind her, a solid warmth in the room, but she also felt the weight of his respect, a palpable thing. She slipped into her thin cotton nightdress and slid under the heavy quilt, the sheets cool against her skin. She heard the soft thud of his boots on the floor, the rustle of the wool blanket as he settled himself by the fire. The cabin fell silent, save for the fire's gentle hiss and pop. Iris lay rigid in the center of the bed, every muscle tense. He was only a few feet away. A chasm of unspoken history and mutual strangeness separated them. Yet he was close enough that she could hear the soft, even sound of his breathing. She listened to it, focusing on its steady rhythm. In and out, a slow, dependable cadence. She matched her own ragged breathing to his, in and out, for the first time in months, perhaps years. She felt a strange and unfamiliar sensation. It was the feeling of a perimeter being established around her, a wall she had not built herself. Out there, beyond the thick log walls, the wind howled, a mournful, hungry sound that spoke of vast, empty spaces and lurking dangers. But in here, inside this small, warm room, the sound was muffled, distant. The fire crackled, a domestic heartbeat. The man on the floor breathed, a steady, living anchor in the dark. It was as if the cabin itself had become a cocoon, a quiet, protected space woven from firelight, solid wood, and the presence of this quiet, honorable man. She lay there, listening, and realized that for the first time, safety had a shape. It was the shape of this room. It had a sound, the crackle of a fire, and the steady breathing of another soul. And it had a feeling, the slow, gradual unclenching of a fist she hadn't even realized she'd been holding. She was still afraid, but the fear was no longer the only thing in the room. She was on an island, and the tide of her terror had, for a moment, receded. The next few days settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Roan rose before the dawn, moving with a ghost-like quietness that never disturbed her sleep. When she finally woke to the pale gray light filtering through the window, she would find the wood box next to the hearth filled to the brim. A small pail of fresh, still warm milk from his lone cow on the table, and the sharp, clean edge of her kitchen knife newly honed. He never mentioned these small acts. They were simply there, like the sunrise. One morning, Iris discovered her best pair of shoes, worn thin and threatening to split at the sole, was missing from its place by the door. A small panic seized her. They were her only sturdy pair, essential for navigating the muddy, uneven ground of the ranch. She searched the small cabin, her anxiety growing with each fruitless moment. She said nothing to Roan when he came in for his midday meal, not wanting to seem accusatory or foolish. He ate in his usual silence, his gray eyes occasionally glancing at her, but his expression offered no clues. That evening, when she returned from a short, tentative walk to the creek, the shoes were back in their spot. She picked one up. The sole was no longer thin and cracked. It had been patched, reinforced with a thick, sturdy piece of dark leather saddle leather. She recognized from the distinct tooling marks. The stitching was a work of raw function over form. The holes had been punched through with a heavy awl, and the waxed thread was pulled tight in a series of large, uneven, but incredibly strong stitches. It was not the work of a skilled cobbler. It was the work of a man who knew how to mend a broken harness, how to make things hold. It was a rough, unbeautiful repair, but it was profoundly kind. She ran her thumb over the coarse thread, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He had noticed her need without her ever speaking it, and he had met it with the skill of his own two hands. Their conversations remained sparse, limited to the necessities. The stew is on the hearth. More wood is needed. The creek is running high. But a different kind of communication was growing between them, a language of actions. He would leave a bucket of water just inside the door to save her the trip to the well. She would ensure a hot pot of coffee was waiting when he returned, chilled, from his long rides checking fence lines. Every spoonful of the simple bean soup they shared was a silent acknowledgement, a slow, methodical process of getting accustomed to the presence of another. They were two solitary creatures learning to share the same small territory, circling each other cautiously, learning each other's habits and respecting each other's boundaries. One evening, as Roan sat by the fire cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and methodical, Iris watched the firelight play across his weathered face. He was focused on his task, his brow furrowed in concentration. In that moment, watching the sheer competence of his hands, a thought formed in her mind, as solid and certain as the stone of the hearth. No one would dare harm the wife of Roan Vale. It wasn't a promise he had made in words. It was a vow embedded in his very being. It was in the steady set of his jaw, the quiet watchfulness in his eyes, the way he carried himself as if he were a part of the hard, unforgiving land itself. He had offered her his name, and that name was a shield. She was safe. The knowledge settled deep in her bones, a warmth that began to thaw the permafrost around her heart. It was a fragile safety, one she was still learning to inhabit, but it was real. And in the fertile ground of that safety, something else was beginning to take root, something tentative and shy. It was the first green shoot of trust, and deep beneath that, in the dark, quiet soil of her guarded heart, a single, forgotten ember, long thought to be extinguished, glowed faintly, waiting for a breath of air to coax it back to life. 3 months earlier, the air in Dry Willow, Kansas, tasted of grit and impending sorrow. It was a flat, wind-scoured town that clung to the edges of the new Orchard Line railroad tracks like a burr on a blanket. The optimism of the railroad had soured quickly, leaving behind a residue of hard men and desperate transactions. This was where Iris Callahan had lost everything, and where her new life, a life of whispered names and watchful fear, had begun. She had left the town with nothing but a small cloth satchel, a few coins stolen from her own savings box, and the list. The list wasn't on paper. Paper could be burned. Paper, she had learned with horrifying finality, was as fragile as a man's life. The list was a brand on her memory, a litany of names she recited in the dark, a poisoned inheritance from her father, Josiah. Josiah Callahan had been a man of quiet faith and meticulous numbers. As the accountant for the small Presbyterian congregation, his world was one of balanced ledgers and God's grace. He believed in order, both divine and mundane. It was this belief that killed him. He had found an imbalance, a darkness lurking in the contribution ledgers that cross-referenced with shipping manifests from the orchard line. He was not a brave man, but he was an honest one. He had intended to speak to the U.S. Marshal in Sentinel Bend, to expose the rot he had uncovered. He never got the chance. The men had come at night. Iris had been woken not by a sound, but by a smell kerosene. She had crept from her small room to see them through a crack in the parlor door, 3 men, bulky in the shadows, their features obscured by the low brims of dark felt hats. They spoke in low, guttural tones to her father. They wanted his private ledgers. When he refused, they had not argued. The sound of the blow was dull, sickeningly soft. Then came the tearing of paper, the splash of more kerosene, and the greedy whoosh of the match. They had burned the church office, with its records, and they had burned her home. With her father inside, they were efficient. They assumed the girl, Iris, had perished with him, but she had survived. She had fled through the back window, clutching only the satchel she'd been mending, and scrambled into the dense, thorny thicket lining Willow Creek. She had stayed there for 2 days, hidden like a terrified rabbit, watching the smoke stain the sky. When the ruins were cold, she had crept back. She hadn't wept. The horror was too vast, too cold, for tears. She had simply knelt in the gray, sodden ash of her father's office. She had sifted the wreckage, her hands scraping against charred wood and shattered glass, until her fingers were raw and bleeding. She was looking for anything, a single scorched page, a fragment of his meticulous script. She found nothing, just ash, and in that moment, kneeling in the ruins of her life, she had made a vow. They had silenced her father. They had burned the proof, but she would not let them burn the truth. She would not scream. She would remember. From the ashes of Dry Willow, she had drifted, a ghost with haunted eyes, to the next town over, finding work at a dismal way station inn called the Cotton Gin. It was a place that smelled of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and despair. She swept floors and washed linens for a cot in a drafty attic room and scraps from the kitchen. She kept her head down, made herself unnoticeable, practiced being invisible. Her terror had subsided into a constant, thrumming vigilance. One humid afternoon, a sound cut through the inn's usual drunken stupor, a deep, wet cough, followed by a groan of pure agony. It came from a small, windowless room at the end of the hall, a room the proprietor rented out by the hour or the week. No questions asked. The sound was ragged, desperate, dying. The innkeeper, a heavy man with a gravy-stained vest, just spat into a spittoon. Just some old sot paying to die upright, long as his coin's good. I don't care. But Iris did. Perhaps it was the echo of her father's final, unheard pleas. She waited until the innkeeper was occupied, then pushed open the warped wooden door. The stench hit her first infection, cheap whiskey, and the metallic tang of old blood. On a narrow cot, a man lay soaked in his own fever sweat. He was old, grizzled, with a tangle of gray beard and the hollowed-out look of a man who had seen too much. A dirty bandage was wrapped around his middle, and a dark, ugly stain was spreading through it. He was a veteran. She saw from the faded blue tatters of a uniform jacket used as a pillow. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and fast. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would be dead by morning. Something in her, the part that had been numbed by the ash, flickered. She couldn't save her father. Perhaps she could save this stranger. She spent the last of her own money not on food, but on a bottle of carbolic from the apothecary. She boiled water in the kitchen, tore strips from her own spare petticoat for clean bandages. She pulled back the filthy dressing, revealing a festering wound in his side, inflamed and angry. He groaned, but didn't wake. She cleaned it as best she could, her stomach churning. She found a sewing needle and some sturdy thread in her satchel, boiled them, and with clumsy, shaking hands, she stitched the wound closed. It was a terrible, ugly seam, but it was the best she could do. For 3 days, she tended to him. She spooned water and bitter willow bark tea, a remedy her mother had used for fevers, between his cracked lips. She sponged his burning face, and in his delirium, the old soldier began to talk. He didn't speak of battlefields or lost loves. He spoke of the present, of a darkness he had seen. He muttered names, disjointed phrases. The orchard line. They ain't cattle. His voice was a dry rasp. They're just gone. Paperwork. All clean. He thrashed, his good hand gripping the thin blanket. Croft. Silas Croft. His ranch is the last stop. Lamat. Damn his black-hearted. Iris sat frozen as the names tumbled out. Names she recognized. Names from her father's quiet, worried whispers. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. The man's eyes opened, and for the first time, they were clear, though filled with the unmistakable light of a guttering candle. He knew he was dying. He looked at Iris, a long, assessing stare. "You stitched me," he rasped. "Good girl. Bad stitchin'." A faint, dry chuckle rattled in his chest. "Who are you?" Iris whispered, her hands clasped tight in her lap. "Eamon Pike." He took a shallow breath. "And I seen what they're doin'. That railroad." His eyes clouded again. Not with fever, but with a terrible memory. "They're usin' it to move people, not like they should. Taking 'em from reservations, from poorhouses, sellin' 'em to mines up north, gangs, workin' 'em till they drop. It's a trade in souls. Girl." He confirmed the very evil her father had uncovered. "Who?" Iris breathed, the word torn from her. "Who runs it?" Eamon's eyes hardened. "The man who put this lead in me. The one who holds the strings. He's a deputy marshal. Name of Beckett Sloan." He seemed to gather his last strength to say the name. "Used to be a railroad man. Now he wears a star. Makes it all legal-like. Smooth. A gentleman. But he's the one. Beckett Sloan." The name settled into place on her mental list, the keystone holding the entire wretched structure together. Eamon fumbled under his thin pillow and pulled out a small, worn object. It was a pocket knife, and with it, a letter, sealed with wax. I was trying to get this to him." He pressed the letter into her hand. "His name's on it. Roan Vale. He's in Wyoming Territory, Vesper County." "Who is he?" "A friend. An old debt." Eamon coughed. A terrible, final sound. Get this to him. Tell him Eamon Pike sent you. Tell him about Sloan. He'll listen. He's a solid man. He'll know what to do." His hand fell open. His last breath sighed out of him. Iris sat with the dead man until dawn. She took the letter. She had a new purpose. She was no longer just running. She was carrying a message. It took her 2 weeks. She fled the cotton gin, walked for miles, and used the last of Eamon's coins to buy passage on a stagecoach heading north, then west. She finally sent a telegraph from a larger town. "Using the barest of details, Eamon Pike is dead. I have his last message. Dry Willow." She gave the name of the town she was in and the boarding house where she'd taken a room. And then she waited, her fear returning with every passing hour. He came 5 days later. He did not look like Eamon's friend. He looked like he was carved from the same hard rock as the mountains he came from. Roan Vale entered the drab boarding house parlor, his hat in his hand, his steady, gray-eyed gaze landing on her. He brought the scent of pine and cold, clean air into the stuffy room. She told him everything. She spoke in a low, flat monotone, the voice of someone who has rehearsed a tragedy so many times it has lost its emotional power, leaving only the sharp-edged facts. She told him about her father, the ledgers, the fire, the men in felt hats. She told him about Eamon, the fever, the clumsy stitching, and the delirious damning confession. She repeated the names Croft, Lamat, and finally, Beckett Sloan. Roan Vale listened. He did not interrupt, did not nod, did not show a flicker of emotion. His stillness was absolute, a heavy, grounding presence in the room. When she was finished, the silence stretched, broken only by a ticking clock. He finally spoke, his voice as low and steady as she remembered it from their first meeting. Eamon Pike pulled me from under a dead horse at Shiloh. I was pinned, and the fire was coming. He took a bullet in the leg doing it. He looked at the floor, then back at her. His eyes were not kind, but they were not cruel. They were appraising. "You're carrying trouble of another's making," he stated. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. Beckett Sloan is not a small man. He has the Orchard Line's money and a marshal's star. They won't stop looking for you. They can't. You know the names. "I know," she whispered. "I have Eamon's letter for you." He took it but didn't open it. "Eamon's dead. What's in here is just ash. Same as your father's ledgers." He set the letter on the table. "You're what matters. You're the one who can talk." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the muddy street. "I have land in Wyoming. It's high country. Hard to get to. I have law there. The kind I make." He turned back to her. "You need both." Iris stared, uncomprehending. What do you mean?" "A woman alone on the frontier is prey," he said, his voice devoid of any romance. "She's a target, but a wife has standing, a wife has cover. My name is known in Vesper County. No one will bother Mrs. Vale." He was offering her a fortress. "Marry me, Miss Callahan," he said, as calmly as if he were offering to buy her a meal. "I'll give you my name and my roof. I'll keep you safe. That's the bargain." It was a proposal without flowers, without music, without a single whisper of affection. It was a contract for survival, a shield offered in exchange for... what? He seemed to read her mind. "I'm not looking for what a husband might expect. I'm looking to honor a debt to a dead man. And my cabin is quiet, too quiet, maybe. You just be there, breathe with me," he'd said. She had asked for one day. She didn't go to a dressmaker. She went to the livery and bought a ticket on the morning stage back to Dry Willow. She stood, for the last time, at the cemetery behind the burned-out church. She stood over the simple wooden cross that marked her father's grave. The wind was relentless, pulling at her hair, trying to scrub the town from the prairie. "I won't let them win, Papa," she whispered to the mound of cold earth. "I can't bring you back, but I can bring them to justice. I will see your truth brought into the light. I promise you." The next morning, she was at the livery when Roan arrived with 2 horses, hers with a practical side saddle. He didn't ask her what she had decided. He saw the answer in the new, hard resolve in her eyes. He just held the reins, and she mounted. She turned her back on Kansas. She turned her back on the ashes and the graves, and she rode west with a stranger into the vast, unknown territory of Wyoming. She was no longer just Iris Callahan, the accountant's daughter. She was a witness. The list was safe. It was no longer on paper, vulnerable to fire and water. It was etched behind her eyes, a litany of names repeated with every beat of her horse's hooves. Croft, Lamat, and Beckett Sloan. The paper was gone, but the memory, fractured and seared by trauma, endured. And as the flat plains gave way to the rising foothills, she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Sloan's hunt was not just for a runaway girl. It was to erase the last living ledger. Life at Cedar Vale was governed by rhythms, not by the clock. The ranch, nestled in a high-country basin within Vesper County, woke to its own time. The first call was the sharp, metallic clang of the bell on the lead hen, a sound that cut through the pre-dawn chill. Then came the distant, rhythmic thud of an axe on wood. Roan already at his morning tasks. It was followed by the lowing of the milk cow, and, on clear mornings, the faint, ringing ting-ting-ting of the blacksmith's hammer from the small settlement, a sound that carried for miles on the thin, clean air. Mist settled in the low pasture, obscuring the creek and clinging to the high grass in a shroud of pearlescent gray, making the world seem soft-edged and quiet. This was the world Iris woke to. In the beginning, she had startled awake in the dark, her heart pounding with a familiar, cold dread, the ghosts of Kansas still fresh. But now, she woke slowly, drawn from sleep by the sounds of a life at work, not one under threat. She would lie still for a moment, listening to the cabin. The fire would already be rebuilt, a low, steady heat radiating from the hearth. She would hear the soft click of the door as Roan left, his movement so practiced in quietness that he seemed to move without disturbing the air. When she finally rose, she would find the evidence of his silent care. The log box, which had been half empty the night before, would be stacked high with split, dry pine and aspen, enough to last the entire day. On the hob, a small metal pitcher of milk, still warm from the cow, sat waiting, and beside the dry sink, her kitchen knife, which she'd left dull from chopping carrots, would be back in its place, the blade glinting, honed to a razor's edge. These small, consistent acts of provision were his language. He did not ask her if she was cold or thirsty, or if the tools she used were adequate. He simply saw the need and met it. In this, he was as reliable as the sunrise. He was building a wall of dependability around her, one log, one bucket of milk, one sharpened blade at a time. Her role in this new life was undefined, a blank page she was hesitant to write on. But the ranch would not wait for her comfort. It demanded work, and work, she found, was its own kind of solace. She began to learn. Her father had been a man of books and ledgers. Her hands were soft, uncalloused, ill-suited to the raw tasks of the frontier. Roan was a patient teacher, though one of few words. "Hey," he said one morning, standing in the barn, the air thick with the sweet, dusty scent of cured grasses. He pulled a handful from one bale. "This is Timothy. Good for bulk." He pulled from another. "This is alfalfa. See the leaves. This is for strength." "For kestrel." He taught her how to groom the gelding, a quiet buckskin named Kestrel, whose intelligent eyes watched her with a wary curiosity. He showed her how to use the curry comb in firm circles, how to pick the packed mud and stones from the hooves. The first time she tried to lift the horse's foot, she flinched, afraid of the animal's size. "He'll give it to you," Roan said, his voice calm from the other side of the stall. "Just be sure. Horses know when you're not." She took a breath, leaned her shoulder into the horse's flank, and ran her hand firmly down its leg. The horse shifted, then lifted its hoof, placing it obediently in her hand. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. It was a moment of trust, earned and given. She learned to saddle. The heavy leather was a confusing puzzle of straps, rings, and buckles. Her first attempt left the cinch too loose, and Roan, without a word of criticism, simply walked over, unbuckled it, and showed her how to pull the latigo strap, using her own weight to tighten it. "Snug enough to hold," he said, tapping the saddle. "Loose enough for him to breathe." It was a lesson she applied to more than just the horse. Their new life was insular, a world bounded by the fences of the ranch, but the world beyond those fences was always waiting. Their first trip to the settlement of Cedar Vale for supplies was a trial by fire. The settlement was little more than a single dusty street with a general store, a smithy, a saloon, and the small, wind-battered church. But in a place this small, a new face was an event. A new wife for the widower, Roan Vale, was a sensation. They entered Mercer's general store, a long room that smelled of coffee beans, cured tobacco, milled flour, and new calico. A few women, gathered by the bolt cloth, stopped their chatter. Their eyes flicked to Iris, then to Roan, then back to Iris. The whispers started almost immediately, sharp as stinging nettles. "That's her," a woman in a severe black bonnet. "Mrs. Pritchard," murmured to her companion, just loud enough to be heard. "Barely 6 months since poor Martha Vale was in the ground. Came from Kansas, I heard," the other woman replied, her eyes dissecting Iris's worn but clean dress, with nothing but the clothes on her back. A mail-order arrangement. My husband reckons. Gossip calls her the fake widow. Mrs. Pritchard sniffed, the term laced with a cruel piety. She's no proper wife. She's just his housekeeper. A convenient one. Iris flinched, the color draining from her face. She felt the old, familiar instinct to shrink, to disappear, to run. She busied herself with a sack of beans, her hands trembling. Roan, who had been at the counter speaking to Mr. Mercer, must have sensed the shift. He didn't turn around. He didn't confront the women. He finished his transaction, took his sack of grain, and walked over to where Iris stood. He didn't stand beside her. He stood directly behind her. He was a solid, immovable presence at her back. He said nothing. He just stood there, a silent wall of protection. The women felt his gaze. Mrs. Pritchard's companion flushed a bright, mottled red and became intensely interested in a display of buttons. Mrs. Pritchard herself tried to hold his gaze, but Roan's eyes were flat, cold, and utterly unmoving. They held no anger, only a quiet, absolute warning. Enough. The woman's self-righteous expression faltered. She huffed, grabbed her companion's arm, and muttered, "We should be going. Agnes." They bustled out of the store, the bell above the door tinkling in their wake. Only then did Roan move. He stepped to Iris's side, his voice perfectly level, as if nothing had happened. "Did you find the baking soda?" He had not raised his voice, not offered a single word of defense. He had simply been there. He had used his presence as a shield, absorbing the barbs meant for her. In the wagon on the way back to the ranch, Iris sat in silence, but the air in her lungs felt different. She felt anchored. His protection was not reserved for strangers. A few weeks later, Roan hired a transient hand named Silas to help him mend the long stretch of fencing in the south pasture. Silas was a lean, restless man with eyes that never seemed to light on one thing for long. Iris, learning her new duties, brought a bucket of fresh water and 2 tin cups out to them at midday. The sun was hot, and the work was hard. She handed the first cup to Roan, who nodded his thanks. As she turned to offer the second to Silas, the man wiped his sweaty brow, his eyes lingering on her, traveling from her face down to her waist in a way that made her skin crawl. A low, suggestive whistle slid from between his teeth. Iris froze. The sound was a violation, a reminder of a world where she was prey. The rhythmic thud of Roan's post-hammer stopped. The silence that fell was heavy, charged. Roan didn't look at Silas. He laid his hammer on the ground, his movements deliberate. He walked to the water bucket, took the second cup from Iris's unresisting hand, and dipped it, handing it to Silas. "Drink," Roan said. His voice was quiet. Silas, sensing the change in the air, took the cup, his earlier bravado faltering. He drank it down quickly. "Your work here is done," Roan said, still in that same level, quiet tone. Silas sputtered. "What, but we ain't halfway done. I was just being friendly." "No," Roan said. He finally looked at the man, and his gray eyes were as hard and unforgiving as granite. "You weren't. Collect your pay from the tin in the tack room. Be off my land by the time I get back." It was not a request. It was an irrevocable fact. Silas looked from Roan's unbending face to the solid set of his shoulders. He saw no room for argument, no hint of violence, but something far more potent absolute certainty. He muttered something under his breath, threw the cup to the ground, and stalked off toward the barn. Roan watched him go. He then picked up the discarded cup, turned to Iris, and said, "Thank you for the water. The sun's hot. You should go back inside." He turned, picked up his hammer, and the steady, rhythmic thud of his work resumed. He had drawn a line, clear and sharp, around her. He had defined her as something to be respected, not appraised. That evening, as the shadows stretched long and blue across the cabin floor, Iris sat by the fire. The air was cool, and she was mending one of Roan's work shirts. Beside the hearth, where she had set them to dry after a walk to the creek, were her mended shoes. She paused in her sewing, looking at them. She ran her finger over the thick, rough stitching. It was not pretty work. It was strong work. It was the work of a man who built fences to keep the wolves out and repaired soles to keep the cold from seeping in. She thought of her own clumsy, desperate stitches on Eamon Pike. An attempt to hold a life in that was already gone. Roan's stitches were the opposite. They were an act of preservation, an act of looking after. She felt a sudden, unexpected warmth bloom in her chest, a feeling so foreign she almost mistook it for pain. It was gratitude. It was the feeling of being, in the truest sense of the word, cared for. The next morning, she woke to the familiar sounds of the ranch, but something was different. On the rough-hewn sill of the small window, a single wildflower sat in a chipped tin cup. It was a daisy, its white petals small and perfect, its center a bright, defiant yellow. She stared at it. This was not part of the rhythm. This was not a necessity. Firewood was a necessity. Warm milk was a necessity. A sharpened knife was a necessity. A flower was. Something else, she knew, with absolute certainty. He had put it there. He must have seen it on his morning ride, dismounted, picked it, and carried it all the way back to the cabin. He had left no note. He would never speak of it. It was a gesture as silent as he was, but it was as bright and clear as a shout. It was a small, beautiful, unnecessary thing. It was, she realized, the first truly gentle thing that had happened to her in a year. Later that day, she sat at the table to make a list for their next trip to Mercer's, in Kansas. Her thoughts had been a frantic, chaotic scramble for survival. But here, in this quiet cabin, her mind felt different. She took a pencil and a piece of brown wrapping paper and began to write. Flour, salt, coffee, lard, beans. Her handwriting, which had been tight and small, now flowed in clear, ordered script. Each word was an anchor. Each item was a plan for a future, for a meal to be cooked, for a week to be lived. She was not just surviving, she was building. She was writing down the inventory of a life, the slow, steady pace of the ranch, the quiet, constant presence of the man who worked it, the feeling of the repaired shoe, and the sight of the single daisy. It was all working on her, like water slowly wearing down a sharp, broken stone. The deep, agonizing doubt was still there, but it was being chipped away, one small, kind act at a time. Trust was growing in its place, a fragile green shoot in hardened soil. The next week, they were in the settlement, picking up a newly shod kestrel from the smithy. As Roan settled the bill with the blacksmith, Iris waited by the wagon. The smithy's door was open, the smell of coal smoke and hot iron filling the air. A man stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. He wore the star of a deputy marshal, but it was new, as was his clean, pressed uniform. He wasn't one of the local men. He nodded to the blacksmith. Then his eyes settled on Iris. A slow, polished smile spread across his face. It was a smile that didn't belong in Vesper County. It was too smooth, too practiced. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am, Mr. Vale." Roan turned, his face impassive, and nodded in acknowledgement. "Jared Kincaid," the new man said, extending a hand to Roan. "Just transferred in. Looks like I'll be the new face of the law in these parts." Roan shook his hand, a brief, firm grip. Kincaid's smile turned back to Iris. His eyes, a light, assessing blue, lingered on her. It wasn't a rude stare, like Silas's. It was something else, something familiar. A cold jolt, sharp and unwelcome, shot through Iris. He was looking at her as if he knew her, or knew of her. The smile was friendly, but it felt like the polished surface of a trap. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Vale," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I do hope you'll find Vesper County to your liking." The name Kincaid was not on her list. But as he turned and walked toward the saloon, his polished boots kicking up small puffs of dust, Iris felt the fragile peace of the last few weeks crack. That smile. She had seen that smile before, or one just like it. It was the smile of the men who thought they owned the world, the men who burned ledgers, the men who worked for Beckett Sloan. The arrival of Deputy Jared Kincaid was like the appearance of a single, unnaturally perfect cloud in a clear sky. It was wrong. He moved with an easy, confident stride that was out of place in the rugged, work-worn settlement of Cedar Vale. His uniform was too clean, his boots too polished, his smile too ready. He was a piece from a different game, set down on their simple, hand-drawn board. His presence became a low, dissonant hum in the background of Iris's days. She saw him from a distance, talking to ranchers in town, leaning against the rail of the saloon porch, his bright silver star glinting in the sun. He was making himself known, ingratiating himself with the locals, but his eyes always seemed to be scanning, searching. Iris knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in her gut, who he was searching for. The confrontation she dreaded came a week after their first meeting. Roan was in the high pasture, checking on a newborn calf, and Iris had walked the half-mile to the creek to gather watercress. The afternoon was quiet, the air warm and smelling of pine and damp earth. She was kneeling by the water's edge, her fingers tracing the cool, green leaves, when the sound of a horse made her look up. Kincaid was sitting on a handsome bay, not 20 feet away, watching her. He hadn't made a sound on his approach. "Afternoon, Mrs. Vale," he said, his voice as smooth and cool as the creek water. He swung down from the saddle, his movements fluid. Iris's heart began a frantic, panicked beat against her ribs. She rose slowly, wiping her wet hands on her apron. "Deputy," she said, her voice tight. He let the reins trail on the ground and walked closer, stopping a few feet from her. His smile was in place, but his eyes were not smiling. They were assessing, probing. "It's a beautiful spot you have here," he said, gesturing to the creek. "Quiet. A person could get lost here, forget things." The words hung in the air, each one a carefully weighted stone. "Or," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "remember them." He took another step. "You know, you put me in mind of a family I knew, back in Kansas. Good, church-going folk, the Abernathys. You have the look of their daughter, Sarah Abernathy." The name was a slap. It wasn't her name, it wasn't even a name she knew, but its wrongness was the point. It was a message, delivered with a polite smile. "I know you are not who you say you are. I can name you and unname you, as I please." It was a cold, deliberate reminder of her stolen identity, a debt being called. "My name is Iris Vale," she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to keep it steady. Kincaid's smile widened slightly, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "Of course it is. My mistake." He glanced down at her hands, which she had instinctively clasped together. He stared at them for a long, unnerving moment, as if he expected to see ash stains under her fingernails, as if he were trying to see the memory of what they had touched. A man like Roan Vale, he deserves a wife with no secrets. A man in his position needs to know who he's sleeping next to. The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare, ugly and intimate. Before Iris could form a reply, another sound broke the stillness, the soft thud of horses' hooves on turf. Roan was riding down the gentle slope from the pasture, Kestrel moving at a steady walk. He had seen them. He didn't urge his horse into a trot. He simply came on, his presence flowing into the small clearing like a tide. He dismounted, his movements economical and sure, and looped Kestrel's reins over a low-hanging branch. He walked to stand between Iris and the deputy. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat and solidness of him at her back, a living shield. He looked at Kincaid, his face calm, his gray eyes unreadable. "Is there a problem?" "Deputy, no problem at all. Mr. Vale," Kincaid said, his tone shifting, becoming more deferential. "Just making my rounds, getting to know the folks in my jurisdiction." Roan's gaze did not waver. "And how is it you know my wife?" The question was quiet, but it had the weight of an accusation. Kincaid gave a small, dismissive laugh. "Oh, we don't know each other, not officially." He tipped his hat. "I was just telling her she reminded me of someone. A trick of the light." He glanced one last time at Iris, a final, parting shot. "You have a good day now, Mrs. Vale." He swung back into his saddle and rode off, leaving a ringing silence behind him. Roan stood for a long time, watching until Kincaid was out of sight. He didn't speak, didn't ask what had been said. He just bent down, picked up Iris's forgotten basket of watercress, and handed it to her. "Let's go home," he said. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer a comfortable quiet, but a heavy, charged thing, filled with unspoken questions. They ate their meal without a word. Iris could feel Rowan's eyes on her, not with suspicion, but with a deep, patient gravity. He was waiting. After he had cleared the table, he did something he had never done before. He took a lantern out to the barn and returned a few minutes later with a heavy wool blanket and his saddle, but he didn't set them by the hearth. He just looked at her. "Come with me," he said. He led her to the barn. The air inside was warm and sweet, smelling of hay, horse, and dry earth. The animals, Kestrel and the milk cow, shifted in their stalls, their soft sounds a gentle counterpoint to the rising wind outside. In an empty stall, clean and swept, Roan had set up a small pot-bellied stove he used for bitter cold nights, and a small fire was already glowing within it, casting a warm, orange light on the wooden walls. He had created a room within a room, a confession box, a place of truth. He laid the blanket on a thick pile of clean straw and placed his saddle against the wall. He gestured for her to sit. He didn't sit beside her, but leaned against the opposite wall of the stall, giving her space, his face half in shadow. The lantern cast a soft, forgiving light. "He's one of them," Iris said, her voice barely a whisper. The words, once spoken, seemed to hang in the warm air. Roan just nodded, his gaze steady. "Tell me." And so she did. The story she had given him in the drab Kansas boarding house had been the skeleton of the truth. Here, in this safe, warm space, she gave him the flesh, the blood, the heart of it. She told him about her father's meticulous nature, his quiet horror at what he was uncovering in the ledgers. She spoke the name of the railroad, the orchard line, and she spoke the name of the man at the center of the web. "Beckett Sloan," she said, the name tasting like poison. "He was the deputy superintendent for the railroad. Now he's a deputy U.S. Marshal. He uses one to feed the other. He stands between commerce and the law, and he bends them both until they break." She explained the terrible trade Eamon Pike had died to expose, how Sloan used his authority to sign off on false transport manifests, moving people desperate immigrants, natives taken from their lands, the poor and the forgotten under the guise of company assets or unskilled labor. He was a broker of human misery, a trafficker hiding behind a polished star and the might of the railroad. "My father had the proof," she said, her voice cracking for the first time. "The real ledgers, showing the payment Sloan received. That's what they came for. That's why they burned everything." When she was finished, the only sounds were the crackle of the small stove and the soft sigh of the wind against the barn roof. She was empty, hollowed out by the telling. Roan was silent for a long time. He pushed himself off the wall and came to crouch in front of her. His gray eyes were dark with a new, somber understanding. "All right," he said, his voice low and firm. "All right." He thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. "There's a place, north of here, Bitterroot Crossing. My first wife's people have a cabin there. It's high up, snowed in all winter. No one goes there. We can be gone by sunrise. We pack what we can carry, and we disappear until spring. By then, Kincaid will have moved on. They'll think you fled the territory." It was a plan. It was simple, logical. It was safety. It was plan A, and every instinct for survival in her screamed to accept it, to run, to hide, to let the snow cover their tracks and bury the past. But then she saw her father's face, smelled the smoke, felt the cold ash on her fingertips. She remembered her promise at his grave, I will see your truth brought into the light." "No," she said, the words small but hard. Roan looked at her, his expression unchanging. "No. If we run, he wins," she said, a new strength building in her voice. "Sloan wins. They all win. They will keep doing what they are doing. The names my father wrote down, the people Eamon Pike saw, their stories die with me if I hide." "Their stories are not your fight," Roan said, his voice still level, but with a new edge of intensity. "Your fight is to stay alive." "It is my fight," she insisted, her breath coming faster. This was not a shout. It was a debate held in fierce, tight whispers. "They made it my fight when they killed my father." "Eamon Pike made it my fight when he gave me that letter. You made it my fight when you brought me here. I brought you here to keep you safe," he countered, his voice a low growl. "Not to watch you walk into a den of wolves. There is a fort, Sentinel Bend." She pressed on, her mind racing. "It's the regional army post and the marshal's main office. If I can get there, if I can give an official statement, a sworn deposition, they can't ignore it. It will force an investigation that Sloan can't control. It brings the light to him. He can't operate in the light." It was Plan B. Responsibility. Justice. "And how do you plan to get to Sentinel Bend?" Roan asked, his voice laced with a raw pragmatism. "It's 100 miles from here, with Kincaid watching every move you make and Sloan's men between here and there. It's a suicide ride." "I don't know how," she admitted, her voice trembling with the force of her conviction. "But I know I have to. I can't live the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. Roan, I can't build a home on a foundation of fear." He stood up and began to pace the narrow confines of the stall, his boots scuffing the straw. "Damn it! Iris!" The curse was soft, torn from him. "Damn it all." He stopped and looked at her, his face a mask of conflict. "I buried one wife. I will not bury another." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about strategy, or justice, or even her father. This was about him. This was about his past, his loss. He saw the look on her face, and the hardness in his expression broke. He scrubbed a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. He came back and knelt before her again. And this time, he took her hands in his. His were rough, calloused, but incredibly warm. "I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of them," he admitted, his voice ragged with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "That's the truth of it. I'm a coward where you're concerned." His confession undid her. It was the most honest, vulnerable, and terrifying thing she had ever heard. The safety he offered wasn't just a roof and a name. It was a piece of his own scarred heart, and she was asking him to risk it. Before she could answer, a loud, insistent pounding came from the cabin door, a sound that carried clearly to the barn. It was followed by a man's voice, amplified by the cold night air. "Roan Vale, open up by the authority of the United States Marshal's office." Roan was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, his hand instinctively going to the hunting knife on his belt. They looked at each other in the lantern light, their debate rendered moot. The voice came again, louder this time, laced with an arrogant authority. It was Kincaid. "I have a warrant to search these premises for property belonging to the Orchard Line Railroad. Reported stolen. Open this door, Vale, or I'll take it down." The search warrant was a lie, and everyone knew it. Kincaid hadn't come for stolen railroad property. He had come for her. Roan handled it with a calm, unbreachable stoniness. He did not raise his voice. He simply opened the cabin door, stood in the frame, and made Kincaid and his 2 hired men conduct their search around him. They went through the motions, overturning the sparse furnishings, their contempt a palpable thing in the small space. They found nothing. Of course. Kincaid left with a thin, promising smile, a promise of future harassment. The incident shattered the fragile peace of the ranch. The walls of the cabin no longer felt thick enough. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. They spoke little of it, but a new, cold tension settled between them. The unspoken debate from the barn Roan's Plan A to flee. Iris's Plan B to fight lay unresolved, a chasm they now carefully walked around. The first snow came 2 weeks later, not as a gentle dusting, but as a sudden, violent assault. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue at noon, turned the color of a bruise by mid-afternoon. The wind rose to a high, keening shriek, driving a horizontal torrent of thick, wet flakes before it. Roan had been out on the range, checking on a small herd of cattle grazing in a sheltered canyon, and he hadn't returned. Iris paced the cabin, from the window to the hearth, her anxiety a living thing. The world outside dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The snow wasn't just falling, it was obliterating the world, erasing the landscape, burying fences and landmarks under a suffocating blanket. By dusk, it was a full-blown blizzard. Just when her fear had sharpened to a fine, piercing point, she heard a faint whinny from the direction of the barn. She threw on Roan's heavy sheepskin coat, which swallowed her whole, and plunged into the storm. The wind tore the breath from her lungs, and the snow stung her face like 1,000 tiny needles. She fought her way to the barn, her world reduced to the few feet of churning white, illuminated by the lantern she carried. She found him inside, half frozen, brushing a thick layer of snow from Kestrel's back. He had managed to haze most of the cattle into the canyon's deeper end, but he was chilled to the bone, his face pale and tight with cold. "There's a line shack, a day's ride west," he said, his words slightly slurred from the cold. "If this keeps up, the drifts will bury them. I have to go out in the morning, try to push them closer." "You can't," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. "You'll die in this. They'll die if I don't," he countered, his logic simple and absolute. "It's my herd." The next morning, the storm had not broken. It had settled into a relentless, howling siege. True to his word, Roan prepared to ride out. Iris, her face set with a resolve that mirrored his own, packed a satchel with dried meat, hardtack, and a thermos of hot coffee. She saddled her own horse. "I'm going with you," she stated. It was not a request. He looked at her, about to argue. Then he saw the look in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had when she'd declared her intention to go to Sentinel Bend. He simply nodded. The world they rode into was an unformed, hostile place. The snow was knee-deep on the horses, and the wind sculpted it into massive, rolling drifts that changed the shape of the land. It was a world of blinding white and howling sound. After 2 hours of brutal, punishing travel, Roan stopped. "We can't just use the reins here," he shouted over the wind. "The horses are walking blind. You have to listen to them, not with your ears, with your body." He urged his horse alongside hers. "Close your eyes," he commanded. She did, plunging herself into a world of pure sound and motion. Feel the horse under you. Use your knees. Feel that slight shift. He's telling you the ground is getting softer. That hesitation in his shoulder. He's sensing a drop-off you can't see. Trust him more than you trust your own eyes right now. She focused, pressing her knees into her horse's warm sides, trying to decipher the subtle language of its muscles. It was a profound lesson in trust, in ceding control, in listening to a deeper instinct. It was the same way she was learning to trust Roan, not by his words, but by the steady, dependable feel of his presence. They found the line shack late in the afternoon, a small, dark shape half buried in a drift. It was little more than a single room, built for cowboys to shelter in during storms just like this one. Inside, it was frigid and smelled of old smoke, pack rats, and pine. But it had a small stove, a stack of dry wood, and 4 solid walls. It was a haven. They worked together, their movements efficient in the small space. He got the fire going while she unsaddled the exhausted horses and rubbed them down with dry sacks in the attached lean-to. The small stove soon glowed a cheerful red-orange, and a profound warmth began to fill the tiny cabin. The storm raged outside, its fury a constant, deep-throated roar. But inside their small wooden box, there was the hiss and crackle of the fire, the scent of melting snow and brewing coffee, and the shared, steaming breath of 2 horses in the next room. They sat on the floor, on a pile of old blankets, sipping the hot, bitter coffee. The shared danger and the intense, focused work had stripped away the tension that had grown between them since Kincaid's visit. Here, in this elemental struggle against the storm, they were not a rancher and his arranged wife. They were simply two people, reliant on each other for survival. As the warmth seeped into her bones, the exhaustion hit, and with it, the ghosts. The howling of the wind began to sound like other things a woman scream. A man's final, terrified shout. The shadows thrown by the lantern twisted into familiar shapes. "I have nightmares," she said, the confession slipping out into the quiet space between them. "Every night, I see the fire, I hear my father, I see their faces, the men in the hats." Roan set his cup down. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He moved closer, not touching her, but his presence was a solid comfort. "I know," he said softly. "Sometimes," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the fire. "I wake up and I can't breathe. It feels like the smoke is still in my lungs, like I'm still in that house." He shifted, turning to face her fully. He reached out, not to hold her, but placed his large, warm hand flat against her chest, over her heart. His touch was not possessive, not romantic. It was grounding. It was a point of anchor in a spinning world. "Breathe," he said, his voice a low, gentle command. "Right here. Feel my hand. Just breathe with me." She closed her eyes, the familiar panic rising in her throat. But his hand was a steady, warm weight. She focused on it. She felt the frantic, shallow rhythm of her own breathing, the wild beat of her heart against his palm. "Slow," he murmured. "In and out. Match me." She listened to his breathing. The same slow, steady cadence she had listened to that first night in his cabin. She forced her own lungs to obey, to match his rhythm. In and out. The knot of panic in her chest began to loosen. The roaring in her ears subsided, replaced by the sound of their two breaths, finding a single, shared tempo. Her shoulders, which had been hunched with tension, slowly relaxed and dropped. She opened her eyes and looked at him. The firelight flickered across his face, softening the hard lines, illuminating the deep, unwavering steadiness in his gray eyes. They were so close. In his eyes, she saw no pity. She saw understanding. She saw a quiet, powerful echo of his own past griefs. He did not have to say, "I am here." His gaze said it for him. Slowly, she leaned forward. It was a small movement, a test. He did not move away. She closed the final inch between them and gently rested her forehead against his. His skin was cool from the lingering chill, but a deep warmth radiated from within. It was not a kiss, but it was more intimate than any kiss she had ever imagined. It was a silent acknowledgement of shared pain, a pressing together of two lonely, wounded souls. It was a gesture of profound, mutual comfort, a survivor's embrace. She stayed there for a long moment, simply breathing, feeling the solidness of him. Then, with the courage that came from this new, quiet intimacy, she lifted her hand and tentatively took his. He did not pull away. His fingers were stiff with cold and work, but they closed around hers. She gently uncurled them, lacing her own slender fingers through his, fitting her palm against his. It was a silent, deliberate signal of consent, an unspoken agreement. Yes, this is right. Stay. The storm outside seemed to redouble its efforts, a gust of wind rattling the small shack to its foundations. The fire in the stove pulsed, casting a brighter light. The intimacy of the moment was so intense, it was almost painful. Iris became aware of the dampness of her heavy wool dress, the chill of it clinging to her skin. It was a practical discomfort, but it was also a barrier. With her free hand, still holding his with the other, she reached behind her back and began to unfasten the buttons of her dress. It was a slow, deliberate act. Roan watched her, his expression unreadable, his breathing still steady. He did not move, did not speak. When the last button was undone, she shrugged the heavy, damp garment from her shoulders, letting it pool around her waist. She was left in her thin cotton chemise for a single, charged moment. Roan's gaze flickered. A man's instinct, perhaps. Then, with a discipline that was as profound as any of his other kindnesses, he turned his head, breaking eye contact, and looked into the fire. He was giving her privacy. He was not assuming this was for him. He was granting her the dignity of her own actions. She stood up, stepped out of the dress, and draped it over a small stool she pulled close to the stove. The warmth of the fire on her skin was a relief. She stood there for a moment, her back to him. She could have wrapped herself in a blanket alone. She could have maintained the safe distance between them. But she didn't want to. She turned back to him. He was still looking at the fire, his profile etched in orange light, his jaw tight. He was waiting for her lead. He was giving her all the power. She picked up the heaviest of the wool blankets from the floor. It was large and smelled of horse and old wool. She walked the few steps to where he sat and, without a word, she opened the blanket wide and settled behind him, wrapping it around both of their shoulders, enclosing them in a shared cocoon of warmth. Only then did he turn his head back to her. His eyes searched hers in the dim light, asking a silent question. She answered by leaning into him, letting her head rest in the hollow of his shoulder. She felt a slight tremble in his arm as he finally relaxed and wrapped it around her, pulling her closer. The subtle shaking was not from the cold. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart through the thin fabric of her chemise and his shirt. She could feel the gentle rise and fall of his chest as they breathed. Once again, in perfect unison. A soft, breathy sound escaped her. Half sigh, half laugh. It was the sound of a tension she had carried for years, finally, letting go. He shifted, and she lifted her head. He looked down at her, his face inches from hers. His hand came up, not to her face, but to her upper arm, his thumb gently stroking her shoulder in a gesture that was infinitely tender, infinitely respectful. It was a final, silent question. "Are you sure?" She answered by lifting her face to his. He lowered his head, and their lips met. The kiss was soft at first, a gentle exploration. It was not a kiss of hungry passion, but of deep, resonant emotion. It was a kiss of gratitude, of relief, of a profound and quiet joy. It deepened, but it remained restrained, his hands never straying from her back and shoulders, holding her as if she were something precious, something to be protected even in this moment of ultimate vulnerability. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and wood smoke and the cold, clean air of the storm. It was the first kiss of her new life. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He didn't say a word. He just held her. They sank down onto the pile of blankets, still wrapped in their shared cocoon, and lay side by side, listening to the storm rage and their own hearts beat a quiet, steady rhythm against the fury of the world. Love, she realized, wasn't always a roaring fire. Sometimes it was a small, warm shelter in a blizzard. It was a shared breath. It was a hand held in the dark. The storm broke sometime before dawn. They woke to a world of absolute silence, the landscape buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The sky was a pale, clean gray. As Roan tended to the horses, Iris stepped outside the shack. The air was frigid, so clean it hurt to breathe. The world was new, reborn. And then she saw them. Leading from the cover of a thick stand of pine trees at the edge of the clearing were two sets of hoof prints. They were not from their horses. They were fresh, made since the storm had stopped. They came to within 50 yards of the line shack, stopped, and then turned and retreated back into the trees. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching them. The silence that followed their return from the line shack was heavier than the snow itself. The intimacy of the storm, the shared breath and heat, had forged a new, unspoken bond between them. But the tracks in the snow were a stark, cold reminder that their small, warm world was a stage, and they were being watched. Roan had crouched by the hoofprints, the pristine snow a blank page that held a damning story. He scraped the packed snow from the bottom of one impression with his bare fingers, his face grim. "These aren't local," he said, his voice flat. He pointed. "See the edges and the clip on the front? This horse was shot at a proper forge. For pavement, maybe. Or a rail yard. Not for high country rock. They're heavy horses. Shod standard. It's the mark of the Orchard Line security force." He stood, the coldness in his eyes nothing to do with the temperature. "Kincaid, he knew where we were. He was waiting for the storm to break, to see if we'd come out. Or maybe, to see if we wouldn't." The implication hung in the frozen air. The line shack had not just been a shelter. It could have been a tomb. The ride back to the ranch was a quiet, tense affair. The world, scrubbed clean and white, no longer looked peaceful. It looked exposed, empty. Every stand of pine, every distant shadow, seemed to hold a watcher. The unspoken question of Plan A versus Plan B had been answered for Roan. There was no running. There was no hiding. Kincaid, and by extension Beckett Sloan, had brought the war to them. Back in the cabin, the new, fragile warmth between them was channeled into a single, focused purpose. They were a partnership now, forged in a blizzard, bound by a common enemy. The next move came not from Kincaid, but from an unexpected quarter. Iris was in Mercer's general store a few days later, her supply list in hand. When she felt a presence beside her, she expected Mrs. Pritchard, with her pious, cutting whispers. Instead, it was a woman she didn't recognize. She was dressed in a practical tweed skirt and a man's jacket, her brown hair pinned in a severe but practical bun. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. "Mrs. Vale?" the woman asked, her voice low, pitched for Iris's ears alone. Iris tensed. "Yes," the woman busied herself by examining a tin of baking powder. "My name is Maeve Hollis. I'm a reporter for the Frontier Standard." She slid her gaze to Iris. "I was a friend of Eamon Pike." Iris's breath caught in her throat. She looked around. Mr. Mercer was in the back, weighing out flour. They were, for the moment, alone. "Eamon, he spoke of me," Maeve continued, her voice quick and efficient. "He sent me a letter before Kansas. He told me what he was looking into. I've been following the Orchard Line's accounts for 6 months. They're dirty, but they're smart." She accidentally knocked the tin of baking powder to the floor. As they both bent to retrieve it, Maeve's hand brushed Iris's, passing her a thick, folded envelope, heavy with a wax seal. "That," Maeve whispered, "is from Circuit Judge Abel Rusk, up at Sentinel Bend. He's one of the few men Sloan doesn't own. It's an official summons. You're being called as a witness in a federal inquiry into the operations of the Orchard Line." This was it, Plan B. Given the full force of the law, "Kincaid is here to stop you," Maeve said, her sharp eyes scanning the street outside the window. "Sloan knows you're the last living witness. He's expecting you to bolt. He wants you to. It's easier to pick off a runner on an open road. It's messy to interfere with a federal witness." "What do I do?" Iris asked, her hand closing around the summons. "The summons provides for an escort. You and your husband ride to the telegraph office in the next town. Send this wire." She passed Iris a slip of paper with a coded message. "It goes directly to Judge Rusk's clerk. A detachment of cavalry from Sentinel Bend will meet you. Do not travel alone. Sloan is a snake, but he's a careful one. He won't risk a public fight with the U.S. Army. He'll try to stop you before you're under their protection." Maeve stood up, her purchase made. "Eamon was a good man. He deserves justice. So does your father." She gave Iris one last, appraising look. "Be careful, Mrs. Vale. The trap is already set." That evening, as Roan returned from the smithy, Kincaid was waiting for him, leaning against the saloon rail as if he owned it. The forced bonhomie was back, his smile as polished and false as his badge. "Mr. Vale, just the man," Kincaid called out, pushing himself off the rail. "I feel we got off on the wrong foot, with that business at your cabin. Let me buy you a drink." No hard feelings. It was a probe, a test. Roan knew it, and he knew Kincaid knew he knew. To refuse was to show fear. To accept was to walk into the lion's den. "I could use a drink," Roan said. his voice level. He tied Kestrel to the rail and followed Kincaid inside. The Golden Yoke saloon was thick with smoke, the smell of sour beer, and the sounds of a poorly tuned piano. Kincaid led him to the bar, ordered a whiskey for himself, and raised an eyebrow at Roan. "Water," Roan said. The bartender, a burly man with a stained apron, complied. Kincaid took a sip of his whiskey, leaning an elbow on the bar. "It's a rough country," he said conversationally. "Heard you two were caught in that blizzard. Must have been a terrible fright for your new wife. She seems fragile. A woman like that, from back east. Maybe she's not built for this place." "My wife is stronger than you think," Roan said, his voice quiet. "Oh, I'm sure," Kincaid replied, his tone slick. "But a man wants to protect his property. This railroad, Mr. Vale. It's progress. It's the future. A man would be a fool to stand in its way. You strike me as a smart man, a man who knows how to hold on to what's his." Rowan didn't respond to the veiled threat. His eyes were not on Kincaid. They were scanning the room, taking inventory. In the back corner, at a round table, sat 3 men. They were not drinking heavily. They were playing a quiet, intense game of dominoes. One had a puckered, star-shaped scar on his cheek. Another was missing the first 2 fingers of his left hand. The third had flat, dead eyes that met Roan's for a beat too long before looking away. These were not local ranch hands. They were gunfighters. They were Kincaid's muscle. The men from the blizzard. The men who would be sent to stop them. Roan finished his water in one deliberate pull. He set the glass down on the bar. "Thanks for the drink, deputy." He turned and walked out, the sound of the clicking dominoes following him into the cold night air. The summons, and Kincaid's poorly disguised threat, galvanized them. The time for waiting was over. They would leave for Sentinel Bend at dawn, 2 days from now, giving them just enough time to meet the cavalry escort Maeve had mentioned. But Roan was a man who believed in having more than one plan. While Iris accepted Plan B, the official legal route, Roan began to quietly prepare Plan C. C was for contingency. C was for survival. He told Iris he was preparing the wagon for the hard trip, but he was doing more than that. She watched him work by lantern light in the barn. He didn't just check the wheels, he pulled them, cleaning and packing the axles with heavy grease until they turned in absolute silence. He spent hours reinforcing a false bottom under the driver's seat. He was not just packing for a 3-day ride. He was packing for an escape. He stored 2 weeks' worth of dried beef, hardtack, and coffee in oilcloth packets. He sharpened his hunting knife to a razor's edge and secured it in a new leather sheath, which he then tacked to the underside of the wagon bench, hidden but within easy reach. He was preparing for a world where the U.S. Army didn't show up. While he prepared their escape, Iris prepared her weapon, her testimony. The trauma of that night in Kansas had left her memory fractured, a broken mirror. She was terrified she would get to the courtroom and the words would fail her. "I need to write it down," she said, her hands trembling as she sat by the cabin fire. "No," Roan said, stopping his work cleaning his rifle. "Paper burns. You taught me that. You have to build it in your head, like a fence line, post by post, so it can't be washed away." He sat across from her. "Tell me. Start at the beginning." "My father," she began, her voice shaking. He was an accountant." "No, the names. Tell me the names," he commanded, his voice not harsh, but firm. She closed her eyes. "Croft," she whispered. "Silas Croft. He's a rancher near Dry Willow. My father said his livestock manifests were a lie. They were the first stop." "Good. Keep going. What's the next post?" "Lamont," she said, the name tasting foul. He ran the freight yard. He switched the cars. He marked them as mining equipment." She went on, hour after hour, night after night. She spoke of the men in the felt hats, the smell of the kerosene, the exact words Eamon Pike had whispered in his delirium. She recounted Kincaid's false smile, his Sarah Abernathy, and she named the man at the top, Beckett Sloan. He signed the dispatches. He took the payments. He wore a star. With every telling, her voice grew stronger. The fragments began to knit together. She was not just remembering. She was rebuilding. She was taking the ash of her past and forging it into a blade. And Roan sat there, listening, his steady gaze giving her the strength to face it. Maeve Hollis made one last, dangerous visit. She appeared at the ranch at midnight, a ghost slipping from the shadows of the cottonwoods. She brought them her own proof. She spread several thin sheets of paper on the table, copies of Orchard Line shipping invoices. "Here," she said, her finger tapping the page. Sloan's signature, authorizing payment for heavy construction supplies to a mining camp at Bitterroot Crossing. Roan looked up. There is no mining camp at Bitterroot Crossing. Just that old cabin. Exactly, Maeve said. It's a ghost entry, but the weight and the cost, they match Eamon's calculations for transporting 50 human souls. This is the money trail. This links Sloan's authority directly to the Phantom cargo. She handed the papers to Iris. This is the bullet for your gun. The night before they were to leave, the wagon was packed and hidden, ready to be hitched. The air in the cabin was thick with an almost unbearable tension. They stood by the hearth, the fire casting their long, dancing shadows on the walls. Roan was quiet for a long time. He reached into his pocket. I'm not a man for things, he began, his voice rough, unpracticed in this. But this is my mother's. He pulled out a simple, dark leather thong. Hanging from it was a single, hammered silver ring. It was not polished or ornate. It was simple, strong, and marked by time. My father had it made for her, by a smith in the high country. It was their promise. He turned it over in his calloused palm, showing her the inside, where 2 letters were roughly engraved. Are I? Iris's brow furrowed. Are and I, she whispered. A rare, faint smile touched the corner of Roan's mouth. Rachel and Isaac, my parents, but I think it's fitting, for Roan and Iris. It was a vow. It was the commitment the hasty, desperate wedding at Birch Chapel had never been. This was not a contract for safety. This was a pledge of his heart. He didn't try to put it on her finger. He lifted the thong and gently, his rough fingers brushing her skin. He tied it around her neck. Keep it hidden, he murmured. Under your shirt. Keep it safe. Iris's hand went to the ring, closing around it. It was cool against her skin, a solid, tangible weight. It was an anchor, stronger than any wall, safer than any roof. She looked up at him, her heart too full for words. She felt, for the first time since her father died, utterly and completely safe. She leaned in, and he met her. A kiss that was not like the one in the storm. This was not about comfort or survival. This was a promise. A sudden, violent crackle from outside shattered the moment. An unnatural bright orange light flashed across the window, painting the cabin in a hellish glow. Roan's transformation was instantaneous. The gentle husband vanished. He released her, grabbing his rifle from its pegs by the door in one fluid motion. "Stay back," he snapped. He kicked the door open, and they were hit by a wave of heat. The grain shed, which held their entire winter's feed for Kestrel and the cow, was an inferno. Flames roared into the night sky, devouring the dry wood and hay. "Roan!" Iris screamed, seeing their entire livelihood, their future, turning to ash. But Roan was already looking past the fire, into the darkness. "They're here," as if summoned by his words. Hoofbeats thudded against the hard-packed earth. 3 riders emerged from the shadows, silhouetted against the roaring fire. It was Kincaid, flanked by the man with the scarred cheek and the one with the dead eyes. They rode up slowly, making no move to help, their faces illuminated by the destruction they had wrought. Kincaid stopped his horse, a look of profound, false pity on his face. He held up a piece of paper, the firelight glinting on his star. "A terrible thing. Fire," he said, his voice carrying easily over the roar. "Seems to follow you, Mrs. Vale. I just received a telegram from the U.S. Marshal in Kansas. They've officially charged a Sarah Abernathy with arson and insurance fraud in connection with her father's death. He smiled, the trap springing shut with a vicious, metallic snap. Now I find you here, with another convenient fire. That's a pattern. Ma'am, that's conspiracy. I'm placing you both under arrest. You for fraud, and you, Mr. Vale, for harboring a known fugitive. The fire was a roaring, hungry mouth, devouring their future, turning the winter's grain to black smoke. Kincaid sat on his horse, a silhouette of smug authority against the inferno. The fraudulent warrant held like a death sentence. Roan's rifle was in his hands, but his body was rigid, caught in the trap. To shoot a lawman, even a corrupt one, was to be an outlaw forever. It's a pattern, ma'am, Kincaid said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. First your father's office, now your husband's barn. You're under arrest. No. Iris's voice was sharp, cutting through the roar of the flames. She stepped out from behind Roan. The silver ring on its leather thong was hidden beneath her dress, but she felt its solid weight against her chest. An anchor. That's enough, deputy, she said. Her hand was in her pocket, and she pulled out the thick, wax-sealed envelope Maeve had given her. She held it up, the firelight catching the official stamp. We are not fugitives. We are federal witnesses under the protection of Judge Abel Rusk of the United States Circuit Court. This is a federal summons. Kincaid's smile faltered. His eyes narrowed. This was not part of the plan. This was a complication. A piece of paper, he began, a sneer returning to his face. A piece of paper that trumps a trumped-up arson charge. Deputy, a new voice called out, sharp and female. Maeve Hollis rode out of the darkness, her rifle held ready across her saddle. She was not alone. Flanking her were two men in the dark blue, yellow-striped uniforms of the U.S. Cavalry. They were not smiling. The senior man, a sergeant with a grizzled beard and cold eyes, rode his horse forward, stopping between Kincaid and the Vales. He looked at the burning shed, then at Kincaid, his expression one of pure, undiluted contempt. Deputy Kincaid, the sergeant said, his voice a low rumble. I am Sergeant Elias Holt. My orders are to escort Mr. and Mrs. Vale to Sentinel Bend to testify before Judge Rusk. This summons, he tapped his own copy, puts them under Army jurisdiction, so you can take your hired guns and your fabricated warrant, and you can ride off my scene. Kincaid's face was a mask of livid fury. He had been outmaneuvered, publicly and completely. He looked from the sergeant's rifle to the troopers, then at Maeve's. He was outgunned, and more importantly, he was outranked. This ain't over, he snarled. No longer the polite lawman. No, it's not, Sergeant Holt agreed, his voice dangerously quiet. But your part in it is, get. Kincaid wheeled his horse, his men following, and they disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the night they had come from. Roan hadn't moved. He let out a long, slow breath, the tension leaving his shoulders. He looked at Iris, who stood firm, the summons still in her hand. Her face was grim, lit by the flames of their burning livelihood, but her eyes were clear. The terror that had haunted her in Kansas was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They left Cedar Vale under a sky the color of old ashes. The sun was a weak, gray smear behind the clouds. There was no time to mourn the grain shed. They hitched the team to the pre-packed wagon Plan C, now their only plan. Sergeant Holt and his trooper, a young man named Casey, took up the rear guard. Maeve Hollis, on her nimble Mustang, rode ahead, a ghost in the gray light, scouting the trail. They entered Ash Hollow Valley, a vast, open scar in the land, and the wind met them head-on. It was a physical thing, a solid wall of cold that screamed down from the high peaks, carrying a fine, stinging ice dust. The world was a symphony of desolate sounds, the high, lonesome shriek of the wind, the metallic jingle of the cavalry's tack, and the constant, agonizing creak-squeak of the wagon wheels grinding on the hard-packed snow. The sound set Iris's teeth on edge, a nail being driven into the cold, silent world. They sat side by side on the wagon bench, wrapped in blankets. the world reduced to the backs of their 2 laboring horses and the vast, hostile whiteness of the valley. "Afraid?" Roan asked, his voice low, not turning his head. Iris stared at the trail ahead, where Maeve had just crested a small rise and disappeared. "Yes," she said, the wind stealing the word from her lips. "I'm terrified." She paused, then added, "But I'm not turning back." Roan's hand, covered in its thick leather glove, moved on the seat between them, just enough to press against her leg. A simple, solid statement. "I am here." That night, they made a cold camp in a small, defensible ring of frozen aspens. The wind had died down, but the temperature had plummeted, the air so cold it felt thin in the lungs. Sergeant Holt and Trooper Casey set a perimeter, their dark blue coats blending into the deep shadows. Maeve sat by the small, smokeless fire they'd built, cleaning her rifle with meticulous, angry motions. Iris sat huddled in a blanket, her hands trembling, not just from the cold, but from the crushing weight of the day, the miles yet to go. She watched Roan checking the horse's hooves by firelight. He finished, his movements economical and sure, and then walked to the back of the wagon. He retrieved his lariat, the rope stiff with cold. He began to work it, his gloved hands warming the fibers, uncoiling it, checking for frays. He saw her watching him, saw the tremor in her hands. He didn't offer platitudes. He crouched in front of her. "Give me your hands," he said. She unwrapped them from the blanket. He took them, held them in his own, and began to rub them, his rough gloves creating a fierce, welcome friction. "You need to keep your mind busy," he said. He picked up a shorter length of rope from his gear. "You know how to tie a knot that holds?" She shook her head. He began to loop the rope, his movements precise. "This is a bowline. Sailors use it, won't slip, won't jam. You can hang a man's life on it." He showed her the loop, the way the rabbit came up out of the hole, around the tree, and back down. He made her do it, guiding her clumsy, half-frozen fingers. "Again," he said. She did it. Again. After her fingers were moving more surely, he took the rope back and began to tie a different knot, a sliding loop at the end of his lariat. "A hondo knot," he said. "This is what makes the loop. But it's got to be tied right, or it'll break under strain." He cinched it tight. "Fear, it's like a spooked horse on the end of a line. Iris, it'll just pull and pull, digging its heels in, till the rope snaps or it pulls the pin." He met her eyes, his own as steady as the stars above. "Your belief, your promise to your father, that's the hitching post. You can't let the fear just drag it around. You've got to tie your belief to that post. Tie it with a knot that holds—" He tapped the hondo he'd just made. "So it doesn't matter how hard the fear pulls. The knot won't slip. It holds. You hold." She nodded, the knot in her throat easing. He wasn't telling her not to be afraid. He was telling her how to be afraid and still stand. He handed her the short rope. "Practice." She spent the next hour tying knots, the simple, repetitive motion a meditation, a physical manifestation of his words, until her hands were steady and her mind was clear. The ambush came the next afternoon. They were in a narrow cut, the trail winding between high, rocky ridges. The snow was deeper here, the world quieter, the high rock walls muffling the wind. It was too quiet. Maeve, riding 50 yards ahead, suddenly threw her hand up, a stark black signal against the snow. The crack of a high-powered rifle echoed. A flat, deadly sound. It wasn't a pistol. It was a long-range buffalo gun. A puff of snow exploded from a drift 10 feet to the left of the wagon. "Down!" Sergeant Holt roared, diving from his horse into the cover of a boulder. "Ridge 2 o'clock sniper." Roan didn't wait. He shoved Iris off the seat, down into the narrow, protected bed of the wagon. In the same motion, he threw his own body over hers, shielding her with his back. The second shot came, a high-velocity thwack, striking the exact spot on the wagon bench where he had been sitting, the wood splintering. "Don't move," He breathed into her hair. He was completely still, his body a heavy, warm shield. He was listening. The crack came again, this time hitting one of the cavalry horses, which screamed and went down, kicking in the snow. "Casey, cover!" Holt yelled. Roan was counting under his breath. 2, 3, 4. He was counting the time it took the sniper to reload his single-shot rifle. He's alone, or at least the shooter is. He shifted his weight, pulling his own rifle from its scabbard by the seat. "Stay down," he commanded. He rose just enough to rest the rifle on the wagon's side. He wasn't aiming at the man. He was aiming at the puff of smoke he'd seen from behind a jumble of rocks on the ridge. He fired. The shot was a loud boom in the confined space. He didn't wait to see if he'd hit. He was just giving a warning, letting the sniper know they were not defenseless. "We're pinned," Holt shouted, firing his own carbine toward the ridge. "He's got the high ground. We can't go back. We can't go forward." Maeve, who had taken cover with her horse behind an outcrop, suddenly did something strange. She unhooked her spare lantern from her saddle, lit it with a quick strike of a match, and gave it a long, underarm swing, her lariat uncoiling. The lantern sailed in a high arc, landing in a snowdrift 50 yards to their left, glowing brightly in the afternoon gloom. It was a false target, a flicker of movement and light. Crack! The sniper took the bait. The bullet shattered the lantern, plunging it back into darkness. "Now go, go!" Maeve screamed. "Ha!" Roan roared, leaping back to the driver's seat and lashing the reins. The horses, terrified, plunged forward. Sergeant Holt and Trooper Casey were up, mounted, and firing, providing cover as they galloped past. The trail opened up, spitting them out onto the bank of a wide, frozen river, Raven's Span. It was the only way across. "Hold on!" Roan yelled. He drove the horses straight onto the ice. The world became a nightmare of cracking, booming sounds. The ice was groaning under the weight of the wagon, thin and treacherous. The horses slipped, their hooves struggling for purchase. The sniper was firing again, his shots zinging off the ice around them, kicking up glittering sprays. Roan stood, his body braced, fighting the reins, forcing the terrified horses forward. They were halfway across when a different sound joined the chaos. Gunfire, but closer. Kincaid's men, the scar-faced man and the dead-eyed one, were riding hard out of the trees on the far bank, trying to cut them off. A bullet thudded into the thick wooden side of the wagon, right next to Roan. He grunted, his whole body lurching, but he didn't falter, his eyes fixed on the far bank. "Roan!" Iris screamed, seeing him stagger. "I'm fine," he yelled, his voice a strained snarl. He gave the horses one last, desperate lash. The wagon wheels hit the gravel of the far bank, and the team scrambled up the snowy incline, pulling them into the cover of the trees. The cavalrymen and Maeve were right behind them. They didn't stop to fight. They plunged into the forest, leaving Kincaid's men yelling in frustration on the other side of the breaking ice. They rode hard for another hour before Roan finally pulled the team to a halt in a thick, dark stand of pine. He was hunched over, his left arm clamped tight against his side. "Roan, you're hit," Iris said, scrambling over the seat. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across the shoulder of his sheepskin coat. "Take them," he gasped, pushing the reins into her hands. His face was pale, beaded with sweat despite the cold. "Just keep them moving. Follow Holt." She took the reins, her hands sure, the hours of knot-tying having steadied her, while he fumbled with the fastenings of his coat. She saw it. This wasn't a fresh wound gushing blood. The bullet hadn't penetrated. It had struck him with such force that it had broken open his old wound from Shiloh, the one Eamon Pike's friend had received. The thick scar tissue had torn, and it was bleeding sluggishly, but the pain was clear, agonizing. He had taken a blow that would have felled most men, and he had held the reins. Now, it was her turn. They arrived at Sentinel Bend just after dusk, a massive, walled fortification against the wilderness. The flag was being lowered, a bugle playing a lonely, mournful call. For the first time, Iris felt a wave of relief. They were safe. They were inside the walls. Sergeant Holt, his face grim, led them directly to the provost marshal's office, a sturdy stone building in the center of the parade ground. "Judge Rusk is waiting," he said, more to himself than to them. "He'll see justice done." They entered the warm, lamp-lit office. Roan was leaning heavily on Iris, his face ashen. Maeve and the sergeant followed them in. A man in a pristine dark blue captain's uniform stood up from behind a large oak desk. He was a handsome man, with polished buttons and a smooth, unblemished face. He was not Judge Rusk. "Mr. and Mrs. Vale, a pleasure," the man said. His smile was polished, practiced, and held the same terrifying, empty coldness as Jared Kincaid's. "We've been expecting you." Sergeant Holt stepped forward, his hand resting on his sidearm, his face a mask of confusion. "Captain, where's Judge Rusk?" The captain smiled, steepling his fingers. "Judge Rusk, Sergeant, was unexpectedly recalled to Washington this morning. A most urgent matter." He looked past them, at Iris and Roan. "I am Captain Morrison, the new deputy post commander. Beckett Sloan is an old friend, and he's asked me to handle his administrative affairs here at the fort. And I must say, Mrs. Vale, we are all very eager to hear your deposition." The air in Captain Morrison's office was a cold, polished trap. The promise of hearing their deposition was a lie, a prelude to a private, unwitnessed disappearance. Roan, his face pale and tight with the agony of his reopened wound, stood beside Iris, his good hand resting on the desk, bracing himself. Maeve Hollis and Sergeant Holt stood near the door, Holt's face a mask of dawning, sickening realization. He was a good soldier, and he was beginning to understand he had just delivered his witnesses to the enemy. "I will not speak," Iris said, her voice clear and cold, "to anyone but Judge Rusk." "The judge," Morrison said with a smile that never touched his eyes, "is indisposed. I am the acting authority at this post. You will speak to me, Mrs. Vale, or you will be held in the stockade for contempt. Your escort," he nodded to Holt, "is dismissed." "I cannot, sir," Sergeant Holt said, his voice a respectful rumble. "My orders are to deliver them to the judge." "Are you disobeying a direct order?" Sergeant Morrison asked, his hand drifting toward his sidearm. The office door flew open with such force that it slammed against the stone wall, the sound echoing like a gunshot. A man filled the doorway. He was not a soldier. He was a barrel-chested mountain of a man in a rumpled black suit and a waistcoat stained with tobacco juice. His face was a map of hard living. His jowls were dark with stubble, and his eyes, under a thicket of gray brows, were burning with a righteous, intelligent fury. "Since when?" a voice like grinding gravel demanded. "Does a cavalry popinjay in a tin soldier's suit hear federal testimony in my jurisdiction?" Captain Morrison shot to his feet, his face draining of color. "Judge Rusk I was told you were recalled to Washington." "You were told a lie, Captain," Rusk growled, advancing into the room. He seemed to suck all the air out of it. He did not look at Iris or Roan. His entire formidable attention was fixed on the cowering officer. "A lie you seemed mighty eager to believe. I was delayed on the pass. Imagine my surprise by a rock slide that looked a hell of a lot like dynamite work. Now get out of my chair, and you." He jabbed a thick finger at Sergeant Holt. "Get this man," he pointed to Roan, "to the post surgeon, and get these women quarters under full guard. Full army guard, not this, private security." Morrison, his authority shattered, stammered, "Yes, sir, Judge." "And you, Captain," Rusk said, stopping him at the door. "You are to remain on post, but you are not to speak to anyone regarding this matter. If you so much as send a telegraph, I will have you in irons for obstruction of federal justice. Is that clear?" Morrison, pale and trembling, just nodded and fled. Judge Rusk finally turned to them. He looked at Roan's bloody shoulder, at Maeve's box of ledgers, and at Iris. His gaze was hard, assessing, but for the first time, Iris felt she was being looked at by the law, not by an enemy. "Be in my courtroom," he said. 8 o'clock, tomorrow morning. And, ma'am, he said to Iris, "you'd best be ready to tell the truth. All of it." The courtroom was not a grand hall. It was a small, cold, functional space, carved from the same gray stone as the rest of the fort. It smelled of damp wool, old wood smoke, and the faint, acidic tang of fear. Every bench was packed. Local ranchers, townsfolk, and a contingent of blue-coated soldiers filled the space. Their presence a silent, watchful jury. Roan sat in the front row, his left arm now bound tightly in a clean white sling, his face a pale mask of exhaustion and pain. But his eyes were clear, fixed, and on Iris. Beside him, Maeve Hollis clutched her wooden box of evidence. Then the side door opened, and Beckett Sloan entered. He was not wearing the dusty trail clothes of a deputy marshal. He was dressed as a titan of industry, in a fine black frock coat with silk lapels, a pearl gray vest, and a starched white collar. He was the picture of civilization, of progress, of money. He was flanked by a thin-lipped, sharp-eyed lawyer from the East, a man who looked as if he'd never seen a dirt road in his life. Sloan radiated a calm, almost bored, confidence. This was a nuisance, not a threat. He nodded politely to Captain Morrison, who sat rigid in the back. He even offered a small, dismissive smile to Roan. He was the king, and this was his court. "All rise." The bailiff called. Judge Abel Rusk entered, his old suit looking even more rumpled in contrast to Sloane's finery. He sat, banged his gavel, and the room fell into a silence as taut as a bowstring. "This court is convened," Rusk growled, "to hear testimony in the federal inquiry into the operations of the Orchard Line Railroad and its associates. Call your first witness." "The inquiry calls Mrs. Iris Vale," the prosecutor said. "A young, earnest captain in Rusk's employ." Iris stood. The walk from her chair to the witness box felt a mile long. She could feel Sloane's eyes on her, amused and cold. She could feel Roan's, hot and steady. She placed her left hand on the worn, cracked leather of the Bible, her right hand raised. As she swore the oath, she could feel the hard, cool shape of the silver ring. R.I. through the fabric of her dress. It was an anchor. Her testimony began, as the outline had predicted, with a tremor. Her voice was a small, fragile thing in the heavy silence. It began with my father, Josiah Callahan. He was an accountant for the church in Dry Willow. "Objection!" Sloane's lawyer snapped, rising. "Hearsay. The witness's father is not here to testify." "He is not here," Iris said, her voice suddenly finding a new, cold clarity. "Because your client's men murdered him and burned him with his ledgers." The courtroom erupted. Sloane's lawyer screamed for a mistrial. Judge Rusk hammered the gavel. "Order, order, ma'am. You will answer the questions. Counselor, your objection is noted, overruled. For now, get to the point of your testimony. Mrs. Vale, what did you see?" Iris locked eyes with the judge. The practiced words, the fence line she had built with Roan in the cabin, now stood firm. "I saw the men who did it. I heard them demand my father's private ledgers, and after they left, I saw what they had come for. A single scorched page from his desk. This was new, even to Roan. A lie, but a necessary one. A truth given flesh." "And what did it say?" the prosecutor asked. "It was a list of names and numbers, payments, from the Orchard Line to shell companies. One was a mining camp at a place called Bitterroot Crossing." Sloane's confident smile tightened. He leaned over to whisper to his lawyer. "These weren't payments for freight, Your Honor." Iris continued, her voice strong now, ringing with her father's own meticulous anger. "They were payments for people. My father found that mister. Sloane was using his authority as a railroad man, and his badge as a U.S. Marshal, to sign false transport manifests. He was moving. Exploited workers, poor immigrants, natives. He was shipping them like cattle under the name of company assets to mines and work gangs. He was taking a fee for every soul. She raised her hand and pointed, not at Sloane, but at the ledgers on Maeve's lap. And the proof is right there. The jury, a collection of hard-bitten ranchers and merchants, began to murmur. They didn't like the railroad, and they didn't like men who profited from misery. Maeve Hollis was called next. She was sharp, professional, and unshakable. She presented the ledgers, the invoices from Part 6. She laid them out for the jury, for the judge. Here, Your Honor, is the official invoice, signed by Mr. Sloane himself, for the transport of heavy mining equipment to the Bitterroot camp. And here, she placed a different paper beside it, is the railroad's own internal tonnage report, showing those cars were empty of any equipment. The weights do match. However, an estimate for 50 human passengers. The prosecutor nodded. The jury's murmuring grew louder. Sloane's lawyer objected again and again, but Rusk waved him off, his eyes scanning the documents, his face growing darker. Sloane was no longer smiling. The tide was turning, and he could feel it. The entire room could, just as the prosecutor was about to rest his case. The courtroom doors burst open. It was not a plea. It was an invasion. Jared Kincaid stood in the doorway, his uniform dusty, his face a mask of false urgency. Behind him stood the scar-faced man, the dead-eyed man, and two other hard cases, all wearing cheap, tin badges that fooled no one. They were a posse of executioners, not lawmen. Your Honor, forgive the intrusion, Kincaid shouted, striding into the center of the room. This entire proceeding must stop. I am here to execute a federal warrant. Rusk's face turned a shade of purple. What is the meaning of this, Kincaid? This is my courtroom. And this is my prisoner, Kincaid snarled, unrolling the warrant from Kansas. He was desperate. This was the panic button. I am here to arrest the witness, Iris Vale, also known as the fugitive Sarah Abernathy, for the crimes of arson, insurance fraud, and the murder of her father. The room exploded. Kincaid's men, taking this as their signal, began to move toward the witness box, their hands on their guns. But Roan Vale was moving, too. Despite the blinding pain in his shoulder, he launched himself from the bench and planted his body directly between Kincaid's men and Iris. He didn't reach for his hidden knife. He didn't need to. He stood, a solid, immovable wall. He spread his arms wide, his good arm and his slung one, a gesture of absolute, defiant protection. He did not shout at Kincaid. He spoke to the jury, his voice booming with contempt, loud enough for every citizen in the room to hear. You'd arrest my wife now, while she's testifying against the man who signs your pay. You'd do it here, in front of the law, in front of these men. It was a challenge, not of guns, but of honor. Bang, bang, bang. Judge Rusk's gavel splintered on the desk. Order, he roared, rising to his full, imposing height. Contempt of court. Kincaid's hand dropped to his pistol. She is a fugitive. She is my witness, Rusk bellowed, his voice shaking the stone walls. And you, sir, are in contempt. I see no law here. I see a conspiracy to obstruct federal justice, Sergeant Holt. Holt and Trooper Casey were on their feet, their own revolvers drawn and leveled. Sir, any man who draws his weapon in this courtroom, Rusk declared, his finger jabbing at Kincaid, will be jailed for a year for obstruction. That is my word and my law now. Get your gutter trash out of my sight. The standoff was absolute. Kincaid's hired guns looked at the two cavalrymen. They looked at Sergeant Holt, a man who clearly would not hesitate to fire. And they looked at the jury box, where the 12 ranchers and merchants were now standing. To a man, in the back, the local blacksmith and 2 other townsfolk had risen, their faces hard. The local militia, the people, had sided with the judge. Sloane saw it. His civilized facade was gone, replaced by a mask of cold, reptilian fury. He had lost control. He gave Kincaid the tiniest, almost invisible signal. Back down. Take it outside. Kincaid seethed, his face mottled red. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him, a weight of judgment heavier than any bullet. Slowly, agonizingly. He lifted his hand from his gun. "Your Honor, I will wait," he growled. "But this warrant will be served. You will wait until I tell you to wait." Rusk snapped. "Now, get out." Kincaid turned, his boots grinding on the stone floor. As he passed the front bench, he locked eyes with Roan. His lips barely moved, but he made a subtle, unmistakable gesture with his chin up, toward the high, snow-covered mountains that separated them from Cedar Vale. He was signaling his men, right there in the open. The trap was being set. The tension in the room remained thick as Kincaid and his men retreated. Judge Rusk, visibly shaking with rage, sat down heavily. He looked at the jury, at Sloane's furious lawyer, at Iris. "This court," he said, his voice ragged, "has seen a great deal. The testimony is grave. The evidence is serious. And the attempts to silence it are beyond disturbing." He took a deep breath. "This court stands adjourned until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, at which point counsel will make their final arguments." He banged the gavel. The sound final. As Sergeant Holt and Trooper Casey moved to escort them to their quarters, Roan stopped. He stood by the window, looking out at the distant white peaks. Kincaid's signal had been a map. "Roan," Iris asked, coming to his side. "What is it?" Roan didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the pass, his face grim. He recognized the terrain in his mind's eye. "He's not waiting for the judge's ruling," Roan said, his voice a low, hard rumble. "He's not going to try to arrest us tomorrow. He knows he's lost in here." He turned to Sergeant Holt. "Kincaid's men aren't riding back. They're riding up. There's a spot on the trail home. Bareback Pass. It's the only way through the high drifts. Narrow, with high rock walls. It's a perfect ambush." He finally looked at Iris, his eyes filled with a terrible certainty. "They're going to hit our escort tomorrow, after the hearing. They'll say we tried to flee, that we fired first. Kincaid isn't just a deputy anymore. He's an executioner." The barracks room at Sentinel Bend was a prison of cold stone and flickering lantern light. The adrenaline of the courtroom had faded, leaving behind the sour taste of fear and the deep, throbbing ache from Rowan's shoulder. Sergeant Holt stood by the barred window, his face a grim mask. "He's right," Holt said, his voice a low rumble. "Kincaid's gesture, that was Bareback Pass. It's the only route high enough to be clear of the deep drifts. And it's a kill box. Sheer walls, no cover. He'll put 2 men with rifles up top and we'll be finished." Maeve Hollis, who had been methodically cleaning the lens of her photographic apparatus, looked up. "Then we don't go to Bareback Pass." "We can't just stay here. Maeve," Iris said, her voice tight. "Sloane owns this fort. Judge Rusk is just one man. Will be shot while trying to escape by morning." Roan, his bad arm in a sling, his good arm pressed tight to his side, was staring at a map tacked to the wall. He had been silent for 10 minutes, his mind 1,000 miles away, walking the land he knew. He pointed a finger at a spot south of the main trail. "Here," he said. His voice was strained with pain, but the iron was back in it. "Lantern Gorge. It's a Badlands cut. Locals say it's haunted, but that's just the wind. It never blows straight. It comes down off the high peaks and swirls, like water in a drain. The ground is alkali dust, soft. A horse can't get good purchase. And it makes a hell of a cloud." "It's a trap," Holt said, looking at the map. "Exactly." Roan said, "We're not going to avoid an ambush. Sergeant, we're going to set our own." The plan was born of desperation and Roan's intimate knowledge of the earth. They would not wait for morning. They would not wait for Sloane's men to get comfortable on the ridge. They would leave now. Holt, his loyalty to the law now fully transferred from the corrupt badge to the righteous judge, agreed. He and Trooper Casey would be their escort. Maeve would ride with them. "But they'll follow our tracks." Casey, the young trooper, said, his voice nervous. "They won't be following our tracks," Maeve said, a grim smile touching her lips. She had a new, cold energy. "They'll be following a ghost. They left the fort an hour after midnight. Judge Rusk, apprised of the plan, had cleared the gate, his face like a thunderhead. "Give 'em hell, son," he'd growled at Roan. They split at the crossroads. Roan, Iris, Holt, and Casey turned the wagon and their horses south, toward the dark, gaping maw of Lantern Gorge. Maeve, meanwhile, took a spare pack mule. She tied a small brass mule bell to its tail and slapped its rump, sending it clattering down the main trail toward Bareback Pass. The sound of the bell, clink, clank, clink, was a perfect, frantic mimicry of a wagon harness being pushed hard in the dark. "Kincaid's scouts will hear that," Roan murmured, guiding his team into the shadows. "They'll think we're making a panicked run for the pass, just like they planned. They'll race to cut us off." Lantern Gorge was a cleft in the earth, a place of deep shadows and unnatural silence. The wind, just as Roan had predicted, was not a steady force. It eddied and sighed, whispering along the high rock walls. They pulled the wagon into a deep, narrow turnout, a scar in the rock wall, invisible from the main trail. And they waited. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence stretched, broken only by the stamp of a nervous horse and the soft, pained sound of Roan's breathing. Iris sat beside him, her hands clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. She was a living bowstring. An hour passed. Then they heard it. The distant thunder of hooves, coming fast. Not the frantic clatter of a single mule, but the unified, driving rhythm of a posse. "They're coming," Holt whispered, leveling his carbine over the wagon's side. "They found the mule," Roan said, his one good hand gripping the reins. "They know it was a trick. They're coming back, and they're angry." The riders burst into the mouth of the gorge like a flood. It was Kincaid in the lead, his face lit by the single, swaying pitch-pine torch held by the scar-faced man. They were 6 riders, dark shapes of malice against the pale starlight. "They're in here," Kincaid's voice echoed. "Find them, block the far end." They thundered past the turnout, blind to the wagon hidden in the deep shadow. "Now, Sergeant," Roan said, his voice calm. Sergeant Holt fired. His carbine cracked, the sound deafening in the narrow space. He wasn't aiming for a man. He was aiming for the rock wall just above them. The bullet struck, sending a shower of stone chips and a small avalanche of shale and loose rock down onto the trail, blocking the posse's retreat. They were trapped. "Here," Kincaid roared, wheeling his horse, realizing they'd been passed. Roan snapped the reins. "Ha!" The wagon burst from its hiding place, horses plunging, pulling the heavy wagon in a sharp, skidding turn that blocked the narrowest part of the gorge. The trap was sprung. Kincaid's men, caught between the rock slide and the wagon, skidded to a halt in a cloud of their own dust. "Now! Iris!" Roan yelled. Iris, who had been poised in the back, heaved 2 heavy burlap sacks over the side. They weren't sand. They were sacks of lies and dry alkali dust from the fort's supply. They burst on the ground, and the swirling wind of the gorge did the rest. It picked up the fine, choking white powder and blasted it backwards, straight into the faces of Kincaid's men. It was a blinding, suffocating storm. Men coughed, eyes streaming. Horses screamed and reared, their riders fighting for control in a world that had become white chaos. The man with the torch was waving it, trying to clear the air. Roan, bracing his rifle on the wagon seat with his one good, shaking hand, took aim. The boom of his rifle was the counterpoint to Holt's. He didn't hit the man. He hit the torch. It exploded in a spray of pitch and fire, falling into the dry, dead brush that lined the gorge wall. The brush ignited with a sound like a giant's gasp. Whoosh! A wall of fire roared to life, and the wind, that strange, swirling wind, fanned it, funneling a tidal wave of thick, acrid smoke directly at the trapped gunmen. Through the smoke, a figure emerged, a demon from the inferno. Kincaid. He had spurred his horse through the edge of the flames, his face a mask of black soot and raw fury. He drove his horse alongside the wagon, his revolver in his hand, his eyes fixed on Roan. "Vale!" he screamed, leveling the pistol. Iris had no time to shout, no time to think. She grabbed the heavy leather mule strap Roan used for the harness, a thick, braided rein with a heavy brass clip. She didn't swing it like a lariat. She threw it, a desperate, weighted fling. The strap whipped through the air, the brass clip catching Kincaid's gun hand with a sickening crack. His shot went wide, burying itself in the wooden wagon bed. A howl of pain tore from his lips as the gun flew from his numbed, possibly broken, fingers. Before he could recover, Iris yanked the strap back with all her strength. Kincaid, off balance, was pulled bodily from his saddle, crashing into the soft, deep dust of the gorge floor. "Sloan up here, you fools! He's up here!" The voice of the scar-faced man. A new voice, cold and furious, cut through the din from high above. "This way, circle around, they're trapped." Iris looked up. On the high ridge, silhouetted against the dark blue sky, sat a seventh rider. He was on a fine, tall horse, well back from the edge. He was not in the fight. He was directing it. Beckett Sloan, the king on the chessboard, had finally shown his face. "Maeve," Roan breathed, his eyes on the ridge, on the opposite ridge. A small, blue-white light flashed, sharp and sudden as a star. It was the magnesium flash of Maeve Hollis's camera. She was not in the gorge. She had taken the high ground. Her bulky apparatus aimed not at the brawl, but at the general. She had captured him. She had her proof. Sloan saw the flash. He knew instantly what it meant. Down below, the fight was not over. Scarface had dismounted, his rifle up. He saw Roan, a clear target on the wagon seat. He fired. The bullet hit Roan with a dull, heavy thud. It struck his right shoulder, his good arm. He made no sound, but his body went rigid, then slumped forward. The reins fell from his useless hands. He was out of the fight. "Roan!" Iris screamed. She scrambled over the seat, dragging him down into the wagon bed as another bullet whined through the air where he had been. The blood was bright, soaking his shirt. His good arm was gone. She looked at the wound, at the chaos, at her husband, pale and bleeding in her lap. The fear, the tremors, the girl who had hidden in the ashes had all burned away. Her eyes were cold, clear, and absolutely resolved. She grabbed a clean canvas tarp, folded it, and pressed it hard against the wound. "Hold on," she commanded, as much to herself as to him. "You... witch!" Kincaid was on his feet, scrambling up the side of the wagon. He was unarmed, but his hands were claws. He grabbed Iris by the front of her dress, yanking her back from Roan. Roan moved. He had no arms, no strength, but he had his weight. With a pained, guttural roar, he launched himself forward, a dead-weight tackle. He hit Kincaid square in the chest, and the two men, locked together, tumbled out of the wagon, crashing hard onto the sandy floor. Roan, in agony, landed on top. Kincaid, his face a mask of hate, clawed at Roan's face, his thumbs going for his eyes. Roan, with no hands to fight, did the only thing he could. He reared his head back and brought it down like a hammer, a vicious headbutt that connected with Kincantainer's nose, a sharp crack of bone. Kincaid went limp, stunned. Roan's knife was on his belt, but he couldn't reach it. He couldn't kill him. He wouldn't. "Iris!" he gasped, his body shaking from the pain and effort. "The strap, tie him!" Iris was out of the wagon in a second. She grabbed the mule strap, her hands sure. Just as Kincaid started to groan and struggle, a new sound filled the gorge, the thunder of a dozen horses, and a clear, bellowing voice. "You! Army, cease fire! Drop your weapons!" Sergeant Holt's cavalry escort, led by Judge Rusk himself, was charging into the gorge, their carbines leveled. They had followed the sound of the battle. They skidded to a halt, taking in the scene, the burning brush, the wagon barrier, the groaning, blinded gunmen, and Roan Vale, kneeling on the chest of a bound Jared Kincaid. Judge Maeve Hollis was riding down the scree slope, holding a glass plate high. "I have him. I have Sloan. I have the picture." The entire posse, Rusk included, looked up to the ridge where Sloan had been. He was gone, but not gone far. Sloan, in his panic, had wheeled his horse, pulling it too hard on the narrow, treacherous shale. The horse, spooked by the magnesium flash and the fire below, had lost its footing. It had gone over the edge, a dark shape tumbling into the blackness. Sloane had thrown himself from the saddle at the last second. He had slid, clawing, down the sheer rock face. His fall had been broken by a single, stunted, ancient cypress tree growing from a crack in the rock. He was there, dangling. His fine, eastern suit was ripped to shreds. His hands, which had signed so many false ledgers, were clamped in a death grip on a thick, gnarled root. He was 100 feet above the gorge floor, suspended between the life he'd built and the justice he'd fled. The posse stared up, silenced. Roan, bleeding, looked up. Kincaid, bound, looked up. And Iris, her hands slick with her husband's blood, stood at the base of the gorge wall, looking at the narrow, winding deer track that led up the cliff. She was the closest one. The wind, the strange, swirling wind of Lantern Gorge, was the only sound. It whispered over the scene of chaos, a cold, impartial witness. Below, the fire guttered, casting long, dancing shadows. The cavalrymen and the judge stood frozen, their faces upturned, and high above, dangling from the gnarled root of a cliffside cypress, was the architect of it all. Beckett Sloane. His fine suit was in tatters, his face was scratched and bleeding, but his voice, when it came, was a serrated, desperate hiss that carried on the wind. "You," he shouted, his eyes locking on Iris. "The girl Callahan helped me pull me up, and I swear on my life, you'll be safe forever. You and your rancher. You'll never hear from the orchard line again. You'll have money, protection, anything, just help me." It was the ultimate temptation, the same promise Roan had made her. But this was a devil's bargain, offered from the mouth of a chasm. It was the promise of an easy peace, of a life without looking over her shoulder. Iris looked from Sloane's terrified, desperate face down to the black, unforgiving void beneath him, a drop that promised only a final, shattering silence. Then she turned and looked at Roan. He was leaning against a boulder where Sergeant Holt had helped him, his face ashen, his two shoulders now a landscape of ruin. Blood soaked his shirt, but his eyes, when they met hers, were absolutely clear. They held no command, no plea, no anger. They held only a profound, unwavering, and complete trust. "It's up to you, Iris," he said, his voice a low, ragged breath. "Your choice." He was giving her the one thing no one else ever had, the full weight and power of her own will. He was not telling her what to do. He was telling her that he would stand by whatever she decided. He had given her a home, his name, his heart, and now he gave her this final, terrible freedom. Her father had died for the truth. Eamon Pike had died to pass it on. Roan had nearly died to defend it. She thought of the cold ash on her fingers, of the promise she had made at a lonely grave in Kansas. She thought of the knot that holds. She turned back to the cliff face. Sloane's face was contorted with a desperate, pleading hope. "The rope," Iris said, her voice not loud, but it cut through the wind. From the wagon, Trooper Casey, his young face a mask of confusion, scrambled to the back of the wagon and returned with the lariat Roan had used to teach her. She took it. The hemp was rough and solid in her hands. "Girl, yes, that's it," Sloane cried, a sob of relief in his voice. "Hurry!" Iris began to climb. The deer track was narrow, treacherous with loose shale, but her mended shoes held firm. She moved with a steady, unhurried grace, her body light with purpose. She did not look down. She did not look at Sloane. She looked at the task. She reached a narrow ledge about 10 feet above him. She braced herself, her feet wide. She worked the rope, forming a loop, just as Roan had shown her. She did not make the sliding hondo of a catch rope. She tied a fixed bowline, the knot of a sailor, the knot that holds a life. She tossed the loop down. It snaked through the air, landing perfectly near his flailing hands. "Put it over your wrists," she commanded. "Both of them." Sloane, weeping with relief, did as he was told, fumbling to get the loop over his hands and up to his wrists. "Pull," he gasped. "Pull me up." Iris did not pull. She took the other end of the rope and, with swift, efficient motions, she wrapped it twice around the thick, stable trunk of the cypress tree itself. She tested the tension, then tied it off with 2 half-hitches. Another knot that would not slip, would not jam. She had not saved him. She had secured him. She had bound him to the scene of his crime like a living confession. She looked down at him, her face impassive in the cold starlight. "You won't fall, Mr. Sloane," she said, her voice carrying on the wind. "You will be brought to justice, my father's justice." His face, when he understood, was a horrifying tapestry of disbelief, fury, and utter defeat. He was no longer a king on a chessboard. He was just a man, tied to a tree, waiting for the law to climb up and collect him. Sergeant Holt and Trooper Casey were already climbing, their movements sure and professional. They reached Sloane, their faces grim, and clipped a set of iron manacles onto his wrists before they even untied Iris's rope. As they hauled him, sputtering and cursing, onto the ledge, Maeve Hollis appeared beside Iris, her face smudged with magnesium powder. She held up the fragile glass plate. "Here it is, Judge!" She called down. Even in the dim light, the image was clear, the unmistakable silhouette of Beckett Sloane on the ridge, his arm outstretched, directing the ambush. It was the coffin nail. Down in the gorge, Kincaid, his broken nose a bloody mess, was being hauled to his feet by 2 more soldiers. His eyes, swollen and filled with hate, found Iris as she made her way back down the path. "You!" he spat, the word thick with blood and malice. "You should have disappeared. You should have just vanished." Iris stopped in front of him. She was no longer afraid of him. He was just a man, a broken tool of a failed tyrant. She looked at him, her eyes holding not pity, not anger, but a calm, final clarity. "I chose to appear," she said. She turned away from him and went to Roan. He was slumping against the rock, the last of his strength gone. She knelt in front of him, her hands going to his face, turning it toward her. His skin was cold, clammy. "Roan," she whispered. He managed a weak, pained smile. His good hand, the right one, lifted from his lap. It was trembling, covered in dust and his own blood. She took it. Her own hand, small and steady, closed around his, and their fingers interlaced. The fit was perfect, as sure and tight as the rough, strong stitching he had put on her old shoes. It was a language their hands knew before their hearts did. The wind sighed through the gorge, a long, mournful sound, carrying the scent of smoke and cold stone. She took the heavy wool blanket from the wagon, the one that had been their cocoon in the line shack, and wrapped it around both of them, pulling him close. She leaned in, and in the midst of the chaos of the groaning prisoners, the stamping horses, the barked orders of the soldiers, she gently, tenderly, touched her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, elemental truth. It was a kiss that tasted of gunpowder and grit and survival. It was deep and warm, and it spoke a single, silent, roaring sentence. "We are alive." She pulled back slightly, her forehead resting against his, their breath mingling in a white cloud in the frigid air. "When I shed that old dress of fear," she whispered, her voice for him alone, "I stepped into your arms and into myself." Roan looked at her, his eyes, so often guarded and distant, now filled with a fierce, burning light. A true, genuine smile, a rare and beautiful thing, touched his lips. "Home," he said, his voice a ragged whisper, "is where you choose to stand." A clatter of chains and the thud of hooves announced the departure. Judge Rusk, his face set like granite, led the procession. Sloane and Kincaid, manacled and on foot, were herded behind him, along with the rest of their captured men. The dust kicked up by the horses rose in a thick, swirling curtain, a final act in a long and bloody play. Closing the scene, the sounds faded, leaving only the wind. Iris tightened her grip on Roan's hand. He leaned his weight against her, and she held him. Together, they looked past the mouth of the gorge, to the east, where the first, faint, gray promise of dawn was touching the distant peaks. They looked toward Sagebrush Reach, toward the smoke of their ruined barn, and the promise of their solid, waiting cabin, toward the place where they would go to heal and to build a new life, not on a foundation of fear, but on the hard, solid ground of a love that had been tested by fire and had held. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like. And consider supporting us further by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.